Chapter 1 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and Cyril M. Kornbluth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Appallingly, the Earth and the Moon had been kidnapped from the solar system. But who were the kidnappers? And what ransom did they want? Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C. M. Kornbluth. Chapter 1. Roget Germain, banker of Wheeling, West Virginia, a citizen, woke gently from a citizen's dreamless sleep. It was the third hour rising time, the time proper to a day of exceptional opportunity to appreciate. Citizen Germain dressed himself in the clothes proper for the appreciation of great works, such as viewing the Empire State ruins against storm clouds from a small boat, or walking in silent single file across the remaining course of the Golden Gate Bridge. Or, as today, one hoped, witnessing the recreation of the sun. Germain with difficulty regained a citizen's necessary calm. One was tempted to meditate on improper things. Would the sun be recreated? What if it were not? He put his mind to his dress. First of all, he put on an old and storied bracelet, a veritable identity bracelet of heavy silver links, and a plate which was inscribed P.F.C. Joe Hartman, Korea, 1953. His fellow jewelry appreciators would have envied him that bracelet if they had been capable of such an emotion as envy. No other ID bracelet as much as 250 years old was known to exist in Wheeling. His finest shirt and pair of light pants went next to his skin, and over them he wore a loose parka whose seams had been carefully weakened. When the sun was recreated, every 5 years or so, it was the custom to remove the parka gravely and rend it with the prescribed graceful gestures, but not so drastically that it could not be stitched together again. Hence the weakened seams. This was, he counted, the 41st day on which he and all of Wheeling had donned the appropriate sun recreation clothing. It was the 41st day on which the sun, no longer white, no longer blazing yellow, no longer even bright red, had risen and displayed a color that was darker maroon and always darker. It had, thought Citizen Germain, never grown so dark and so cold in all his life. Perhaps it was an occasion for special viewing. For surely it would never come again, this opportunity to see the old sun so near to death, one hoped. Gravely, Citizen Germain completed his dressing, thinking only of the act of dressing itself. It was by no means his specialty, but he considered, when it was done, that he had done it well, in the traditional flowing gestures with no flailing, at all times balanced lightly on the ball of the foot. It was all the more perfectly consummated because no one saw it but himself. He woke his wife gently by placing the palm of his hand on her forehead as she lay neatly, in the prescribed fashion, on the woman's third of the bed. The warmth of his hand gradually penetrated the layers of sleep. Her eyes demurely opened. "Citizeness Germain," he greeted her, making the assurance of identity sign with his left hand. "Citizen Germain," she said, with the assurance of identity inclination of the head, which was prescribed when the hands were covered. He retired to his tiny study. It was the time appropriate to meditation on the properties of connectivity. Citizen Germain was skilled in meditation, even for a banker. It was a grace in which he schooled himself since earliest childhood. Citizen Germain, his young face composed, his slim body erect as he sat, but in no way tense or straining, successfully blanked out, one after another, all of the external sounds and sights and feelings that interfered with proper meditation. His mind was very nearly vacant, except for one central problem: connectivity. Over his head and behind, out of sight, the cold air of the room seemed to thicken and form call it a blob of air. There was a name for these blobs of air. They had been seen before. They were a known fact of existence in Wheeling and in all the world. They came, they hovered, and they went away, sometimes not alone. If someone had been in the room with Citizen Germain to look at it, he would have seen a distortion, a twisting of what was behind the blob, like a flawed glass, a lens, like an eye, and they were called eye. Germain meditated. The blob of air grew and slowly moved. A vagrant current that spun out from it caught a fragment of paper and whirled it to the floor. Germain stirred. The blob retreated. Germain, all unaware, disciplined his thoughts to disregard the interruption, to return to the central problem of connectivity. The blob hovered. From the other room, his wife's small, thrice-repeated throat clearing signaled to him that she was dressed. Germain got up to go to her. His mind returned to the world, and the overhead eye spun restlessly and disappeared. Some miles east of Wheeling, Glen Tropial, of a class which found it wisest to give itself no special name, and which had devoted much time and thought to shaking the unwelcome name it had been given, awoke on the couch of his apartment. He sat up shivering. It was cold. The damned sun was still bloody dark outside the window, and the apartment was soggy and chilled. He had kicked off the blankets in his sleep. Why couldn't he learn to sleep quietly like anybody else? Lacking a robe, he clutched the blankets around him, got up, and walked to the unglassed window. It was not unusual for Glen Tropial to wake up on his couch. This happened because Gala Tropial had a temper and was inclined to exile him from her bed after a quarrel, and, the operative factor, he knew he always had the advantage over her for the whole day following the night's exile. Therefore, the quarrel was worth it. An advantage was, by definition, worth anything you paid for it, or else it was no advantage. He could hear her moving about in one of the other rooms, and cocked an ear, satisfied. She wasn't waking him. Therefore, she was about to make amends. A little itch in his spine, or his brain, it was not a physical itch, so he couldn't locate it. He could only be sure it was there, stopped troubling him momentarily. He was winning a contest. It was Glen Tropial's nature to win contests, and his nature to create them. Gala Tropial, young, dark, attractive, with a haunted look, came in tentatively carrying coffee from some secret hoard of hers. Glen Tropial affected not to notice. He stared coldly at the cold landscape. The sea, white with thin ice, was nearly out of sight, so far had it retreated as the little sun waned. "Glen?" Ah, good. Glen. Where was the proper mode of first greeting one's husband? Where was the prescribed throat clearing upon entering a room? Assiduously, he had untaught her the meticulous ritual of manners that they had all been brought up to know. And it was the greatest of his many victories over her that sometimes, now, she was the aggressor. She would be the first to depart from the formal behavior prescribed for citizens. Depravity, perversion. Sometimes they would touch each other at times which were not the appropriate coming together times. Gala sat on her husband's lap in the late evening, perhaps, or Tropial kissed her awake in the morning. Sometimes he would force her to let him watch her dress. No, not now, for the cold of the waning sun made that sort of frolic unattractive. But she had permitted it before, and such was his mastery over her that he knew she would permit it again, when the sun was recreated. If, a thought came to him, if the sun was recreated. He turned away from the cold outside and looked at his wife. "Good morning, darling." She was contrite. He demanded jarringly, "Is it?" Deliberately he stretched. Deliberately he yawned. Deliberately he scratched his chest. Every movement was ugly. Gala Tropial quivered and said nothing. Tropial flung himself on the better of the two chairs, one hairy leg protruding from under the wrapped blanket. His wife was on her best behavior, in his unique terms. She didn't avert her eyes. "What have you got there?" he asked. "Coffee?" "Yes, dear. I thought, where'd you get it?" The haunted eyes looked away. Still better, thought Glen Tropial, more satisfied than usual. She's been ransacking the old warehouse again. It was a trick he had taught her, and like all of the illicit tricks she had learned from him, a handy weapon when he chose to use it. It was not prescribed that a citizen should rummage through old places. A citizen did his work, whatever that work might be, banker, baker, or furniture repairman. He received what rewards were his due for the work he did. A citizen never took anything that was not his due, not even if it lay abandoned and rotting. It was one of the differences between Glenn Tropile and the people he moved among. "I've got it made," he exulted. "It was what I needed to clinch my victory over her." He spoke. "I need you more than I need coffee, Gala." She looked up, troubled. "What would I do," he demanded, "if a beam fell on you one day while you were scrambling through the fancy groceries? How can you take such chances? Don't you know what you mean to me?" She sniffed a couple of times. She said brokenly, "Darling, about last night, I'm sorry." And Miserable held out the cup. He took it and set it down. He took her hand and looked at her and kissed it lingeringly. He felt her tremble. Then she gave him a wild, adoring look and flung herself into his arms. A new dominance cycle was begun at the moment he returned her frantic kisses. Glenn knew and Gala knew that he had over her an edge, an advantage, the weather gauge, initiative of fire, percentage, the can't-lose lack of tension. Call it anything, but it was life itself to such as Glenn Tropile. He knew, and she knew, that having the advantage he would press it, and she would yield, on, in a rising spiral. He did it because it was his life, the attaining of an advantage over anyone he might encounter, because he was, unwelcomely but justly, called a son of the wolf. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citizen and Citizeness Rogier Germain walked down Pine Street in the chill and dusk of, one hoped, a sun recreation morning. It was the convention to pretend that this was a morning like any other morning. It was not proper either to cast frequent hopeful glances at the sky, nor yet to seem disturbed or afraid, because this was, after all, the 41st such morning since those whose specialty was sky viewing had come to believe the recreation of the sun was near. The citizen and his citizeness exchanged the assurance of identity sign with a few old friends, and stopped to converse. This was also a convention of skill divorced from purpose. The conversation was without relevance to anything that any one of the participants might know, or think, or wish to ask. Germain said to his friends a 20-word poem he had made in honor of the occasion, and heard their responses. They did line capping for a while, until someone indicated unhappiness and a wish to change by frowning the two grooves between his brows. The game was deftly ended with an improvised rhymed exchange. Casually, Citizen Germain glanced aloft. The sky change had not begun yet. The dying old sun hung just over the horizon, east and south, much more south than east. It was an ugly thought, but suppose, thought Germain, just suppose that the sun was not recreated today, or tomorrow, or ever. The citizen got a grip on himself and told his wife, "Shall we dine at the oatmeal stall?" The citizeness did not immediately reply. When Germain glanced at her with well-masked surprise, he found her almost staring down the dim street at a citizen who moved almost in a stride, almost swinging his arms, scarcely graceful. "That might be more wolf than man," she said doubtfully. Germain knew the fellow. Tropile was his name, one of those curious few who made their homes outside of Wheeling, though they were not farmers. Germain had had banking dealings with him, or would have had if it had been up to Tropile. That is a careless man, he decided, and an ill-bred one. They moved toward the oatmeal stall with the gait of citizens, arms limp, feet scarcely lifted, slumped forward a little. This was the ancient gait of 1,500 calories per day, not one of which could be squandered. There was a need for more calories, so many for walking, so many for gathering food, So many for the economical pleasures of the citizens. So many more, oh, many more these days, to keep the cold out. Yet there were no more calories. The diet the whole world lived on was a bare subsistence diet. It was impossible to farm well when half the world's land was part of the time drowned in the rising sea, part of the time smothered in falling snow. Citizens knew this, and, knowing, did not struggle. It was ungraceful to struggle, particularly when one could not win. Only, well, wolves struggled, wasting calories, lacking grace. Citizen Germain turned his mind to more pleasant things. He allowed himself his first foretaste of the oatmeal. It would be warm in the bowl, hot in the throat, a comfort in the belly. There was a great deal of pleasure there in weather like this, when the cold plucked through the loosened seams, and the wind came up the sides of the hills. Not that there wasn't pleasure in the cold itself, for that matter. It was proper that one should be cold now, just before the recreation of the sun, when the old sun was smoky red, and the new one not yet kindled. "Still looks like a wolf to me," his wife was muttering. "Candace," Germain reproved his citizeness, but took the sting out of it with a quirked smile. The man with the ugly manners was standing at the very bar of the oatmeal stall where they were heading. In the gloom of mid-morning, he was all angles and strained lines. His head was turned awkwardly on his shoulders, peering toward the back of the stall where the vendor was rhythmically measuring grain into a pot. His hands were rested helter-skelter on the counter, not hanging by his sides. Citizen Germain felt the faint shudder from his wife. But he did not reprove her again, for who could blame her? The exhibition was revolting. She said faintly, "Citizen, might we dine on bread this morning?" He hesitated and glanced again at the ugly man. He said indulgently, knowing that he was indulgent, "On sun recreation morning, the citizeness may dine on bread." Bearing in mind the occasion, it was only a small favor, and therefore a very proper one. The bread was good, very good. They shared out half a kilo between them, and ate it in silence, as it deserved. Germain finished his first portion, and, in the prescribed pause before beginning his second, elected to refresh his eyes upward. He nodded to his wife and stepped outside. Overhead, the old sun parceled out the last barrel scrapings of heat. It was larger than the stars around it, but many of them were nearly as bright. A high-pitched male voice said, "Citizen Germain, good morning." Germain was caught off balance. He took his eyes off the sky, half-turned, glanced at the face of the person who had spoken to him, raised his hand in the assurance of identity sign. It was all very quick and fluid, almost too quick, for he had his fingers bent nearly into the sign for female friends, and this was a man. Citizen Boyne. Germain knew him well. They had shared an ice viewing at Niagara a year before. Germain recovered quickly enough, but it had been disconcerting. He improvised swiftly. "There are stars, but are the stars still there if there is no sun?" It was a hurried effort, he grieved, but no doubt Boyne would pick it up and carry it along. Boyne had always been very good, very graceful. Boyne did no such thing. "Good morning," he said again, faintly. He glanced at the stars overhead, as though trying to unravel what Germain was talking about. He said accusingly, his voice cracking sharply, "There isn't any sun, Germain. What do you think of that?" Germain swallowed. "Citizen, perhaps you—" "No sun, you hear me?" the man sobbed. "It's cold, Germain. The pyramids aren't going to give us another sun. Do you know that? They're going to starve us, freeze us. They're through with us. We're done, all of us." He was nearly screaming. All up and down Pine Street, people were trying not to look at him, and some of them were failing. Boyne clutched at Germain helplessly. Revolted, Germain drew back. Bodily contact! It seemed to bring the man to his senses. Reason returned to his eyes. He said, He stopped and stared about him. "I think I'll have bread for breakfast," he said foolishly, and plunged into the stall. Boyne left behind him a shaken citizen, caught halfway into the wrist flip of parting, staring after him with jaw slack and eyes wide, as though Germain had no manners either. All this on Sun Recreation Day. What could it mean? Germain wondered fretfully, worriedly. Was Boyne on the point of... Could Boyne be about to... Germain drew back from the thought. There was one thing that might explain Boyne's behavior, but it was not a proper speculation for one citizen to make about another. All the same, Germain dared the thought. All the same, it did seem almost as though Citizen Boyne were on the point of, well, running amok. At the oatmeal stall, Glenn Tropile thumped on the counter. The laggard oatmeal vendor finally brought the ritual bowl of salt and the pitcher of thin milk. Tropile took his paper twist of salt from the top of a neatly arranged pile in the bowl. He glanced at the vendor. His fingers hesitated. Then, quickly, he ripped the twist of paper into his oatmeal and covered it to the permitted level with milk. He ate quickly and efficiently, watching the street outside. They were wandering and mooning about, as always, maybe today more than most days, since they hoped it would be the day the sun blossomed flame once more. Tropile always thought of the wandering, mooning citizens as they. There was a we somewhere for Tropile, no doubt, but Tropile had not yet located it, not even in the bonds of the marriage contract. He was in no hurry. At the age of 14, Glenn Tropile had reluctantly come to realize certain things about himself, that he disliked being bested, that he had to have a certain advantage in all his dealings, or an intolerable itch in the mind drove him to discomfort. The things added up to a terrifying fear, gradually becoming knowledge, that the only we that could properly include him was one that was not very wise to join. He had realized, in fact, that he was a wolf. For some years Tropile had struggled against it, for wolf was an obscene word. The children he played with were punished severely for saying it, and for almost nothing else. It was not proper for one citizen to advantage himself at the expense of another. Wolves did that. It was proper for a citizen to accept what he had, not to strive for more, to find beauty in small things, to accommodate himself with the minimum of strain and awkwardness to whatever his life happened to be. Wolves were not like that. Wolves never meditated. Wolves never appreciated. Wolves never translated. That supreme fulfillment, granted only to those who succeed in a perfect meditation, that surrender of the world and the flesh by taking leave of both, which would never be achieved by a wolf. Accordingly, Glenn Tropile had tried very hard to do all the things that wolves could not do. He had nearly succeeded. His specialty, water watching, had been most rewarding. He had achieved many partly successful meditations on connectivity. And yet he was still a wolf, for he still felt that burning, itching urge to triumph and to hold an advantage. For that reason, it was almost impossible for him to make friends among the citizens, and gradually he had almost stopped trying. Tropile had arrived in Wheeling nearly a year before, making him one of the early settlers in point of time. And yet there was not a citizen in the street who was prepared to exchange recognition gestures with him. He knew them, nearly every one. He knew their names and their wives' names. He knew what northern states they had moved down from with the spreading of the ice as the sun grew dim. He knew very nearly to the quarter of a gram what stores of sugar and salt and coffee each one of them had put away, for their guests, of course, not for themselves. The well-bred citizen hoarded only for the entertainment of others. Tropile knew these things because there was an advantage in knowing them, but there was no advantage in having anyone know him. A few did. That banker Germain. Tropile had approached him only a few months before about a prospective loan, but it had been a chancy, nervous encounter. The idea was so luminously simple to Tropile. Organize an expedition to the coal mines that had once flourished nearby. Find the coal. Bring it to Wheeling. Heat the houses. And yet it had seemed blasphemous to Germain. Tropile had counted himself lucky merely to have been refused the loan, instead of being cried out upon as a wolf. The oatmeal vendor was fussing worriedly around his neat stack of paper twists in the salt bowl. Tropile avoided the man's eyes. Tropile was not interested in the little wry smile of self-deprecation which the vendor would make to him, given half a chance. Tropile knew well enough what was disturbing the vendor. Let it disturb him. It was Tropile's custom to take extra twists of salt. They were in his pockets now, and they would stay there. Let the vendor wonder why he was short. Tropile licked the bowl of his spoon and stepped into the street. He was comfortably aware, under a double-thick parka, that the wind was blowing very cold. A citizen passed him, walking alone. Odd, thought Tropile. He was walking rapidly, and there was a look of taut despair on his face. Still more odd. Odd enough to be worth another look, because that sort of haste, that sort of abstraction, suggested something to Tropile. They were in no way normal to the gentle sheep of the class they, except in one particular circumstance. Glenn Tropile crossed the street to follow the abstracted citizen whose name he knew was Boyne. The man blundered into Citizen Germain outside the baker's stall, and Tropile stood back out of easy sight, watching and listening. Boyne was on the ragged edge of breakdown. What Tropile heard and saw confirmed his diagnosis. The one particular circumstance was close to happening. Citizen Boyne was on the verge of running amok. Tropile looked at the man with amusement and contempt. Amok. Amok. The gentle sheep could be pushed too far. He had seen citizens run amok. The signs were obvious. There was pretty sure to be an advantage in it for Glenn Tropile. There was an advantage in almost anything, if you looked for it. He watched and waited. He picked his spot with care, so that he could see Citizen Boyne inside the baker's stall, making a dismal botch of slashing his quarter kilo of bread from the morning loaf. He waited for Boyne to come racing out. Boyne did. A yell, loud, piercing. It was Citizen Germain shrilling, "Amok! Amok!" A scream, an enraged wordless cry from Boyne, and the baker's knife glinting in the faint light as Boyne swung it. And then citizens began scattering in every direction, all of the citizens but one. One citizen was under the knife, his own knife as it happened. It was the baker himself. Boyne chopped and chopped again, and then Boyne came out roaring, the broad knife whistling about his head. The gentle citizens fled panicked before him. He struck at their retreating forms and screamed and struck again. Amok. It was the one peculiar circumstance when they forgot to be gracious. One of the two, Tropile corrected himself as he strode across to the baker's stall. His brow furrowed because there was another circumstance when they lacked grace, and one which affected him nearly. He watched the maddened creature Boyne already far down the road, chasing a knot of citizens around a corner. Tropile sighed and stepped into the baker's stall to see what he might gain from this. Boyne would wear himself out. The surging rage would leave him as quickly as it came. He would be a sheep again, and the other sheep would close in and capture him. That was what happened when a citizen ran amok. It was a measure of what pressures were on the citizens that, at any moment, there might be 1 gram of pressure too much, and one of them would crack. It had happened here in Wheeling twice in the past 2 months. Glenn Tropile had seen it happen in Pittsburgh, Altoona, and Bronxville. There was a limit to the pressure that can be endured. Tropile walked into the baker's stall and looked down without emotion at the slaughtered baker. The corpse was a gory mess, but Tropile had seen corpses before. He looked around the stall, calculating. As a starter, he bent to pick up a quarter kilo of bread Boyne had dropped, dusted it off, and slipped it into his pocket. Food was always useful. Given enough food, perhaps Boyne would not have run amok. Was it simple hunger they cracked under? Or the knowledge of the thing on Mount Everest? Or the hovering eyes? Or the sought-after dreaded prospect of translation? Or merely the strain of keeping up their laboriously figured lives? Did it matter? They cracked and ran amok, and Tropile never would. and that was what mattered. He leaned across the counter, reaching for what was left of the morning bread, and found himself staring into the terrified large eyes of Citizeness Germaine. She screamed, "Wolf! Citizens, help me! Wolf!" Tropile faltered. He hadn't even seen the damned woman, and there she was, rising up from behind the counter, screaming her head off. "Wolf! Wolf!" He said sharply, "Citizeness, I beg you." But that was no good. The evidence was on him, and her screams would fetch others. Tropile panicked. He started toward her to silence her, but that was no good either. He whirled. She was screaming, and there were people to hear. Tropile darted into the street, but they were popping out of every doorway now, appearing from every rat's hole in which they had hid to escape Boyne. "Please," he cried, sobbing, "wait a minute." But they wouldn't wait. They had heard the woman, and maybe some of them had seen him with the bread. They were all around him. No, they were all over him. They were clutching at him, tearing at his soft, warm furs. They pulled at his pockets, and the stolen twists of salt spilled accusingly out. They yanked at his sleeves, and even the stout, unweakened seams ripped open. He was fairly captured. "Wolf!" they shouted. "Wolf!" It drowned out the distant noise from where Boyne had finally been run to earth, a block or more away. It drowned out everything. It was the other circumstance when they forgot to be gracious, when they had trapped the son of the wolf. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Engineering had long ago come to an end. Engineering is possible under one condition of the equation: total available calories divided by population equals artistic technological style. When the ratio of calories to population is large, say 5,000 or more, 5,000 daily calories for each living person, then the artistic technological style is big. People carve Mount Rushmore. They build great foundries. They manufacture enormous automobiles to carry one housewife half a mile for the purchase of one lipstick. Life is coarse and rich when the C:(P) is large. At the other extreme, when the C:(P) is too small, life does not exist at all. It has starved out. Experimentally, add little increments to the C:(P), and it will be some time before the right-hand side of the equation becomes significant. But at last, in the 1,000 to 1,500 calorie range, artistic technological style firmly appears in a self-perpetuating form. C:(P) in that range produces the small arts, the appreciations, the peaceful arrangements of necessities into subtle relationships of traditionally agreed upon virtue. Think of Japan locked into its shogunate prison, with a hungry population scrabbling food out of the mountainsides, and beauty out of the arrangements of lichens. The small, inexpensive, sub-arts are characteristic of the 1,000 to 1,500 calorie range. And this was the range of Earth, the world of 10 billion men, when the planet was stolen by its new binary. Some few persons inexpensively studied the study of science, with pencil and renewable paper. But the last research accelerator had long since been shut down. The juice from its hydropower dam was needed to supply meager light to 1 million homes, and to cook the pablum of 2 million brand new babies. In those days, one dedicated Byzantine wrote the definitive encyclopedia of engineering, though he was no engineer. Its 420 tiny volumes examined exhaustively the engineering feats of ancient Greece and Egypt, the wall of Shi-1T, the Gothic builders, Brunel, who changed the face of England, the Roeblings of Brooklyn, Groves of the Pentagon, Duggan of the shelter system, before C:(P) dropped to the point where war became vanishingly implausible, Laverne of Operation Up. But the encyclopedist could not use a slide rule without thinking, faltering, jotting down his decimals. And then the magnitudes grew less. Under the tectonic and climatic battering of the great abduction of Earth from its primary, Under the sine wave advances to and retreats from the equator of the ice sheath, as the small successor suns waxed, waned, and died, and were replaced, the ratio C:P remained stable. C had diminished enormously, so had P. As the calories to support life grew scarce, so the consuming mouths of mankind grew less in number. The 45 small suns shone on no engineers. Not even on the binary, perhaps. The pyramids, the things on the binary, the thing on Mount Everest, they were not engineers. They employed a crude metaphysic based on dissection and shoving. They had no elegant field theories. All they knew was that everything came apart, and that if you pushed a thing, it would move. If your biggest push would not move a thing, you took it apart and pushed the parts, and then it would move. Sometimes, for nuclear effect, they had to take things apart into 3 times 109 pieces, and shove each piece very carefully. By taking apart and shoving, then, they landed one of their spaceships on the burnt-out sunlet. 4 human beings were on that ship. They meditated briefly on connectivity and died screaming. A point of new flame appeared on the sunlet's surface, and the spaceship scrambled for the binary. The point of flame went from cherry through orange into blue-white and began to spread. At the moment of the recreation of the sun, there was rejoicing on the earth. Not quite everywhere, though. In Wheeling's House of the 5 Regulations, Glenn Tropile waited unquietly for death. Citizen Boyne, who had run amok and slaughtered the baker, shared Tropile's room and his doom, but not his rage. Boyne, with demure pleasure, was composing his death poem. "Talk to me," snapped Tropile. "Why are we here? What did you do, and why did you do it? What have I done? Why don't I pick up a bench and kill you with it? You would have killed me 2 hours ago, if I'd caught your eye." There was no satisfaction in Citizen Boyne. The passions were burned out of him. He politely tendered Tropile the famous aphorism, "Citizen, the art of living is the substitution of unimportant, answerable questions for important, unanswerable ones. Come, let us appreciate the newborn sun." He turned to the window where the spark of blue-white flame in what had once been the crater of Tycho was beginning to spread across the charred moon. Tropile was child enough of his culture to turn with him, almost involuntarily. He was silent. That blue-white infinitesimal up there growing slowly, the oneness, the calm rapture of being in the universe that you shaded into without harsh discontinua, the being one with the great blue-white gem-flower blossoming now in the heavens that was no different stuff than you yourself. He closed his eyes, calm, and meditated on connectivity. He was being good. By the time the fusion reaction had covered the whole small disk of the sunlet, a quarter of an hour at the most, his meditation began to wear off. Tropile shrugged out of his torn parka, not bothering to rip it further. It was already growing warm in the room. Citizen Boyne, of course, was carefully opening every seam with graceful rending motions, miming great and smooth effort of the biceps and trapezius. But the meditation was over, and as Tropile watched his cellmate, he screamed a silent, "Why?" Since his adolescence, that wailing syllable had seldom been far from his mind. It could be silenced by appreciation and meditation. Tropile's specialty was water watching, and he was so good at it that several beginners had asked him for instruction in the subtle art, in spite of his notorious oddities of life and manner. He enjoyed water watching. He almost pitied anybody so single-mindedly devoted to, say, clouds and odors, great game though it was, that he had never even tried water watching. And after a session of watching, when one was lucky enough to observe the 9 boiling stages in classic perfection, one might slip into meditation and be harmonious, feel good. But what did one do when the meditations failed, as they had failed him? What did one do when they came further and further apart? became less and less intense, could be inspired, finally, only by a huge event, like the renewal of the sun. One went amok, he always thought. But he had not. Boyne had. He had been declared a son of the wolf, on no evidence that he could understand. Yet he had not run amok. Still, the penalties were the same, he thought, uncomfortably aware of the familiar itch. Not the inward intolerable itch of needing the advantage, but the localized sensation at the base of his spine. The penalties for all gross crimes, wolfhood or running amok, were the same, and simply this: they would perform a lumbar puncture. He would make a donation of spinal fluid. He would be dead. The keeper of the House of Five Regulations, an old man, Citizen Harmain, looked in on his charges, approvingly at Boyne, with a beclouded expression at Glenn Tropile. It was thought that even wolves were entitled to the common human decencies in the brief interval between exposure and the donation of fluid. The keeper would not have dreamed of scowling at the detective wolf, or of interfering with whatever wretched imitation of meditation before dying the creature might practice. But he could not, all the same, bring himself to offer even an assurance of identity gesture. Tropile had no such qualms. He scowled at Keeper Harmain with such ferocity that the old man almost hurried away. He turned an almost equally ugly scowl upon Citizen Boyne. How dare that knife murderer be so calm, so relaxed? Tropile said brutally, "They'll kill us. You know that? They'll stick a needle in our spines and drain us dry. It hurts. Do you understand me? They're going to drain us, and then they're going to drink our spinal fluid, and it's going to hurt." He was gently corrected. "We shall make a donation," Citizen Boyne said calmly. "Is not the difference intelligible to a son of the wolf?" True culture demanded that the remark be accepted as a friendly joke, possibly based on a truth. How else would an unpalatable truth be put in words? Otherwise, the unthinkable might happen. They might quarrel. They might even come to blows. The appropriate mild smile formed on Tropile's lips, but harshly he wiped it off. They were going to kill him. He would not smile for them. The effort was enormous. "I am not the son of the wolf," he howled desperately, knowing that he was protesting to the men of all men in Wheeling who didn't care, and who could do the least about it if he did. "What's this crazy talk about wolves? I don't know what a son of a wolf is, and I don't think you or anybody else does. All I know is that I was acting sensibly, and everybody began howling. You're supposed to know the son of a wolf by his unculture, his ignorance, his violence. But you chopped down 3 people, and I only picked up a piece of bread, and I'm supposed to be the dangerous one." "Wolves never know they're wolves," sighed Citizen Boyne. "Fish probably think they're birds, and you evidently think you're a citizen. Would a citizen speak as you are speaking?" "But they're going to kill us." "Then why aren't you composing your death poem?" Glenn Tropile took a deep breath. Something was biting him. It was bad enough that he was about to die, bad enough that he had done nothing worth dying for. But what was gnawing at him now had nothing to do with dying. The percentages were going the wrong way. This pale citizen was getting an edge on him. An engorged gland in Tropile's adrenals, it was only a pinhead in Citizen Boyne's, gushed raw hormones into his bloodstream. He could die, yes. That was a skill everyone had to acquire sooner or later. But while he was alive, he could not stand to be bested in an encounter, an argument, a relationship. Not and stay alive. Wolf? They called him Wolf. Call him operator or percentage player. Call him sharp article. Call him gamesman. If there was an advantage to be derived, he would derive it. It was the way he was put together. He said, for a time, "You're right. Stupid of me. I must have lost my head." He thought. Some men think by poking problems apart. Some think by laying facts side by side to compare. Tropile's thinking was neither of these. but a species of judo. He conceded to his opponent such things as strength, armor, resources. He didn't need these things for himself. To every contest, the opponent brought enough of them to supply two. It was Tropile's habit, and wolfish he had to admit, to use the opponent's strength against him, to break the opponent against his own steel walls. He thought. The first thing was to make up his mind. He was Wolf. Then let him be Wolf. He wouldn't stay around for the spinal tap. He would go from there. But how? The second thing was to plan. There were obstacles. Citizen Boyne was one. The keeper of the House of the Five Regulations was another. Where was the pole that would permit him to vault over these hurdles? There was always his wife Gala. He owned her. She would do what he wished, provided he made her want to do it. Yes, Gala. He walked to the door and shouted to Citizen Harmain, "Keeper! I must see my wife! Have her brought to me!" It was impossible for the keeper to refuse. He called gently, "I will invite the citizeness," and toddled away. The third thing was time. Tropile turned to Citizen Boyne. "Citizen," he said persuasively, "since your death poem is ready and mine is not, will you be gracious enough to go first when they come?" Citizen Boyne looked temperately at his cellmate and made the quirked smile. "You see," he said, "Wolf." And that was true. But what was also true was that Boyne couldn't and didn't refuse. End of Wolfbane, Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Half a world away, the midnight blue pyramid sat on its planed-off peak, as it had sat since the days when Earth had a real sun of its own. It was of no importance to the pyramid that Glenn Tropile was about to receive a slim catheter into his spine to drain his saps and his life. It didn't matter to the pyramid that the pretext for the execution was an act which human history had long stopped considering a capital crime. Ritual sacrifice, in any guise, made no difference to the pyramid. The pyramid saw them come, and the pyramid saw them go. If the pyramid could be said to see one human being more or less, what matter? Who bothers to take the census of the cells in a hangnail? And yet the pyramid did have a kind of interest in Glenn Tropile, or at least in the human race of which he was a part. Nobody knew much about the pyramids, but everybody knew that much. They wanted something. Else why would they have bothered to steal Earth? The date of the theft was 2027. A great year. The year of the first landings on the runaway planet that had come blundering into the solar system. Maybe those landings were a mistake, although they were a great triumph, too. But maybe if it hadn't been for the landings, the runaway planet might have run right through the ecliptic and away. However, the triumphal mistake was made, and that was the first time a human eye saw a pyramid. Shortly after, though not before a radio message was sent, that human eye winked out forever. But by then the damage was done. What passed in a pyramid for attention had been attracted. The next thing that happened sent the wireless channels between Palomar and Pernambuco, between Greenwich and the Cape of Good Hope, buzzing and worrying, as astronomers all over the earth reported and confirmed and reconfirmed the astonishing fact that our planet was on the move. Rejoice in Messiahs had come to take us away. A world of 10 billion people, some of them brilliant, some of them brave, built and flung the giant rockets of Operation Up at the invader. Nothing. The first and only interplanetary expeditionary force was boosted up to no gravity and dropped onto the new planet to strike back. Nothing. Earth moved spirally outward. If a battle could not be won, then perhaps a migration. New ships were built in haste. but they lay there rusting as the sun grew small and the ice grew thick, because there was no place to go. Not Mars, not the moon, which was trailing along, not choking Venus or crushing Jupiter. The migration was defeated as surely as the war, there being no place to migrate to. One pyramid came to Earth, only one. It shaved the crest off the highest mountain there was and squatted on it. An observer? A warden? Whatever it was, it stayed. The sun grew too distant to be of use, and out of the old moon, the pyramid aliens built a new small sun in the sky. A 5-year sun that burned out and was replaced again and again and endlessly again. It had been a fierce struggle against unbeatable odds on the part of the 10 billion, and when the uselessness of struggle was demonstrated at last, many of the 10 billion froze to death, and many of them starved, and nearly all of the rest had something frozen or starved out of them. And what was left 2 centuries and more later was more or less like Citizen Boyne, except for a very few, like Glenn Tropile. Gala Tropile stared miserably at her husband. "I want to get out of here," he was saying urgently. "They mean to kill me. Gala, you know you can't make yourself suffer by letting them kill me." She wailed, "I can't." Tropile looked over his shoulder. Citizen Boyne was fingering the texture contrasts of a gold watch case, which had been his father's and soon would be his son's. Boyne's eyes were closed, and he wasn't listening. Tropile leaned forward and deliberately put his hands on his wife's arm. She started and flushed, of course. "You can," he said, "and what's more, you will. You can help me out of here. I insist on it, Gala, because I must save you that pain." He took his hand off her arm, content. He said harshly, "Darling, don't you think I know how much we have always meant to each other?" She looked at him wretchedly. Fretfully, she tore at the billowing, filmy sleeve of her summer blouse. The seams hadn't been loosened. There had not been time. She had just been getting into the appropriate Sun Recreation Day costume to be worn under the parka when the messenger had come with the news about her husband. She avoided his eyes. "If you're really Wolf..." Tropile's subadrenals pulsed and filled him with confident strength. "You know what I am. You better than anyone else." It was a sly reminder of their curious, furtive behavior together. Like the hand on her arm, it had its effect. After all, why do we quarrel the way we did last night? He hurried on. The job of the rowel was to spur her to action, not to inflame a wound. "Because we're important to each other. I know that you would count on me to help if you were in trouble, and I know that you'd be hurt, deeply, Gala, if I didn't count on you." She sniffed and scuffed the bright strap over her open-toed sandal. Then she met his eyes. It was the after effect of the argument, of course. Glenn Tropile knew just how heavily he could rely on the after spiral of a quarrel. She was submitting. She glanced furtively at Citizen Boyne and lowered her voice. "What do I have to do?" she whispered. In 5 minutes she was gone, but that was more than enough time. Tropile had at least 30 minutes left. They would take Boyne first, he had seen to that. And once Boyne was gone... Tropile wrenched the leg off his 3-legged stool and sat precariously balanced on the other 2. He tossed the loose leg clattering into the corner. The keeper of the House of 5 Regulations ambled slack-bodied by and glanced into the room. "Wolf, what happened to your stool?" Tropile made a left-handed sign of no importance. "It doesn't matter, except that it's hard to meditate sitting on this thing, with every muscle tensing and fighting against each other to keep my balance." The keeper made an overruling sign of "please let me help." "It's your last half hour, Wolf," he reminded Tropile. "I'll fix the stool for you." He entered and slammed and banged it together, and left with an expression of mild concern. Even the son of the Wolf was entitled to the fullest appreciation of the unique opportunity for meditation. the last half hour before a donation. In 5 minutes, the keeper was back, looking solemn yet glad, like the bearer of serious but welcome tidings. "It is time for the first donation," he announced. "Which of you—" "Him," said Tropile, quickly pointing. Boyne opened his eyes calmly and nodded. He got to his feet, made a formal leave-taking bow to Tropile, and followed the keeper toward his donation and his death. As they were going out, Tropile coughed a "would you please grant me a favor" cough. The keeper paused. "What is it, Wolf?" Tropile showed him the empty water pitcher. Empty, all right. He had emptied it out the window. "My apologies," the keeper said, flustered, and hurried Boyne along. He came back almost at once to fill the pitcher, even though he should be there to watch Boyne's ceremonial donation. Tropile stood there looking at the keeper. His subadrenals began to pound like the rolling boil of well-aged water. The keeper was at a disadvantage. He had been neglectful of his charge, a broken stool, no water in the pitcher, and a citizen brought up in a citizen's maze of consideration and tact could not help but be humiliated, seeking to make amends. Tropile pressed his advantage home. "Wait," he said to the keeper. "I'd like to talk to you." The keeper hesitated, torn. "The donation." "Damn the donation," Tropile said calmly. "After all, what is it but sticking a pipe into a man's backbone and sucking out the juice that keeps him alive? It's killing, that's all." The keeper turned literally white. Tropile was speaking blasphemy, and he wasn't stopping. "I want to tell you about my wife," Tropile went on, assuming a confidential air. "Now there's a real woman. Not one of those frozen-up citizenesses, you know. Why, she and I used to—" he hesitated. "You're a man of the world, aren't you?" he demanded. "I mean, you've seen life." "I suppose so," the keeper said faintly. "Then you won't be shocked," Tropile lied. "Well, let me tell you, there's a lot to women that these stuffed shirt citizens don't know about. Boy, ever seen a woman's knee?" He sniggered. "Ever kissed a woman with—" he winked, "with the light on? Ever sit in a big armchair, say, with a woman on your lap, all soft and heavy and kind of warm and slumped up against your chest, you know, and—" He stopped and swallowed. He was almost making himself retch. It was so hard to say these things. But he forced himself to go on. "Well, that's what she and I used to do. Plenty. All the time. That's what I call a real woman." He stopped, warned by the keeper's sudden change of expression, glazed eyes, strangling breath. He had gone too far. He had only wanted to paralyze the man, revolt him, put him out of commission, but he was overdoing it. He jumped forward and caught the keeper as he fell, fainting. Tropile callously emptied the water pitcher over the man. The keeper sneezed and sat up groggily. He focused his eyes on Tropile and agonizingly blushed. Tropile said harshly, "I wish to see the new sun from the street." The request was incredible. Even after the unbelievable obscenities he had heard, the keeper was not prepared for this. He was staggered. Tropile was in detention regarding the fifth regulation. That was all there was to it. Such persons were not to be released from their quarters. The keeper knew it. The world knew it. Tropile knew it. It was an obscenity, even greater than the lurid tales of perverted lust, for Tropile had asked something which was impossible. No one ever asked anything that was impossible to grant, for no one could ever refuse anything. That was utterly graceless, unthinkable. One could only attempt to compromise. The keeper stammeringly said, May I let you see the new sun from the corridor?" And even that was wretchedly wrong, but he had to offer something. One always offered something. The keeper had never since babyhood given a flat no to anybody about anything. No citizen had. A flat no led to anger strong words, perhaps even hurt feelings. The only flat no conceivable was the enormous terminal no of an amok. Short of that, one offered, one split the difference, one was invariably filled with tepid pleasure when, invariably, the offer was accepted, the difference was split, both parties were satisfied. "That will do for a start," Tropile snarled. "Open, man, open! Don't make me wait!" The keeper reeled and unlatched the door to the corridor. Now the street. "I can't!" burst in an anguished cry from the keeper. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob, hopelessly incapacitated. "The street," Tropile said remorselessly. He himself felt wrenchingly ill. He was going against custom that had ruled his own life as surely as the keeper's. But he was Wolf. "I will be Wolf," he growled, and advanced upon the keeper. "My wife," he said, "I didn't finish telling you. Sometimes she used to put her arms around me and just snuggle up. And I remember one time she kissed my ear. Broad daylight. It felt funny and warm. I can't describe it." Whimpering, the keeper flung the keys at Tropile and tottered brokenly away. He was out of action. Tropile himself was nearly as bad off. The difference was that he continued to function. The words coming from him had seared like acid in his throat. "They call me Wolf," he said aloud, reeling against the wall. "I will be one." He unlocked the outer door, and his wife was waiting, holding in her arms the things he had asked her to bring. Tropile said strangely to her, "I am steel and fire. I am Wolf, full of the old moxie." She wailed, "Glenn, are you sure I'm doing the right thing?" He laughed unsteadily and led her by the arm through the deserted streets. The end of Wolfbane, Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citizen Germain, as was his right by position and status as a connoisseur, helped prepare Citizen Boyne for his donation. There was nothing much to it, which made it an elaborate and lengthy task according to the ethic of the citizens. It had to be protracted, each step being surrounded by the fullest dress of ritual. It was done in the broad daylight of the new sun, and as many of the 300 citizens of Wheeling as could manage it would be there in the courtyard of the old Federal building to watch. The nature of the ceremony was this: a man who revealed himself a wolf, or who finally crumbled under the demands of life and ran amok, could not be allowed to live. He was hauled before an audience of his equals and permitted, with the help of regretful force, if that should be necessary, but preferably not, to make a donation of spinal fluid. Execution was murder, and murder was not permitted under the gentle code of the citizens. This was not execution. The draining of a man's spinal fluid did not kill him. It only ensured that, after a time, and with much suffering, his internal chemistry would so arrange itself that it would continue to function, only not in a way that would sustain life. Once the donation was made, the problem was completely altered, of course. Suffering was bad in itself. To save the donor from the suffering that lay ahead, it was the custom to have the oldest and gentlest citizen on hand stand by with a sharp-edged knife. When the donation was complete, the donor's head was removed, purely to avert suffering. That was not execution either, but only the hastening of the inevitable end. The dozen or so citizens whose rank permitted them to assist then dissolved the spinal fluids in water and ceremoniously sipped them, at which time it was proper to offer a small poem in commentary. All in all, it was a perfectly splendid opportunity for the purest form of meditation for everyone concerned. Citizen Germain, whose role was catheter bearer, took his place behind the introducer bearer, the enunciators, and the questioner of purpose. As he passed Citizen Boyne, Germain assisted him to assume the proper crouched-over position. Boyne looked up gratefully, and Germain found the occasion correct for a commendatory half-smile. The questioner of purpose said solemnly to Boyne, "It is your privilege to make a donation here today. Do you wish to do so?" "I do," said Boyne raptly. The anxiety had passed. Clearly he was confident of making a good donation. Germain approved with all his heart. The annunciators, in alternate stanzas, announced the right pause for meditation to the meager crowd, and all fell silent. Citizen Germain began the process of blanking out his mind, to ready himself for the great opportunity to appreciate what lay ahead. A sound distracted him. He glanced up irritably. It seemed to be coming from the House of Five Regulations. A man's voice, carrying. But no one else appeared to notice it. All of the watchers, all of those on the stone steps, were in somber meditation. Germain tried to return his thoughts to where they belonged, but something was troubling him. He had caught a glimpse of the donor, and there had been something. He angrily permitted himself to look up once more to see just what it had been about Citizen Boyne that had attracted his attention. Yes, there was something. Over the form of Citizen Boyne, silent, barely visible, a flicker of life and motion. Nothing tangible. It was as if the air itself were in motion. It was, Germain thought with a bursting heart, it was an eye. The veritable miracle of translation, and it was about to take place here and now, upon the person of Citizen Boyne, and no one knew it but Germain himself. In this last surmise, Citizen Germain was wrong. Or was he? True, no other human eye saw the flawed glass thing that twisted in the air over Boyne's prostrate body. But there was, in a sense, another witness, some thousands of miles away. The pyramid on Mount Everest stirred. It did not move, but something about it moved, or changed, or radiated. The pyramid surveyed its cabbage patch, wristwatch mine. As much sense, it may be, to say wristwatch patch or cabbage mine. At any rate, it surveyed what to it was a place where intricate mechanisms grew, ripened, and were dug up at the moment of usefulness, whereupon they were quick frozen and wired into circuits. Through signals perceptible to it, the pyramids had become aware that one of its mechanisms was now ready to be plucked, harvested. The pyramid's blood was dielectric fluid. Its limbs were electrostatic charges. Its philosophy was, unscrew it and push. Its motivation was survival. Survival today was not what survival once had been for a pyramid. Once, survival had merely been gliding along on a cushion of repellent charges, streaming electrons behind for the push, sending HF pulses out often enough to get a picture of their bounced return to integrate deep inside. If the picture showed something metabolizable, one metabolized it. One broke it down into molecules by lashing it with the surplus protons left over from the dispersed electrons. One absorbed the molecules. Sometimes the metabolized object was an immobile, sometimes a mobile, a vague, theoretical, frivolous classification to a philosophy whose basis was that everything unscrewed. If it was a mobile, one sometimes had to move after it. That was the difference. The essential was survival, not making idle distinctions. And one small part of survival today was the Everest Pyramid's job. It sat and waited. It sent out its HF pulses, bouncing and scattering, and it bounced and scattered them additionally on their return. Deep inside, the more than anthropomorphically distorted picture was reintegrated. Deeper inside, it was interpreted and evaluated for its part in survival. There was a need for certain mechanisms which grew on this planet. At irregular times, the pyramid evaluated the picture to the effect that a mechanism, a wristwatch, so to speak, was ripe for plucking, and by electrostatic charges, it did so. The electrostatic charges, in forming, produced what the humans called an eye. But the pyramid had no use for names. It merely plucked when the mechanism was ripe. It had found that a mechanism was ripe now. A world away, before the steps of Wheeling's Federal Building, electrostatic charges gathered above the component whose name was Citizen Boyne. There was a small sound like the clapping of two hands, which made the 300 citizens of Wheeling jerk upright out of their meditations. The sound was air filling the gap that had once been occupied by Citizen Boyne, who had instantly vanished, who had, in a word, been ripe, and therefore been plucked. The end of Chapter 5 of Wolfbane. Chapter 6 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Glenn Tropile and his sobbing wife passed the night in the stubble of a cornfield. Neither of them slept much. Tropile, numbed by contact with the iron chill of the field, it would be months before the new sun warmed the earth enough for it to begin radiating in turn, tossed restlessly, dreaming. He was Wolf. Let it be so, he told himself again and again. I will be Wolf. I will strike back at the citizens. I will... Always the thought trailed off. He would exactly what? What could he do? Migration was an answer. Go to another city. With Gala, he guessed. Start a new life where he was not known as Wolf. And then what? Try to live a sheep's life, as he had tried all his years? There was the question of whether, in fact, he could manage to find a city where he was not known. The human race was migratory in these years of subjection to the never quite understood rules of the pyramids. It was a matter of insulation. When the new sun was young, it was hot, and there was plenty of warmth. It was possible to spread north and south, away from the final line of permafrost, which, in North America, came just above the old Mason-Dixon line. When the sun was dying, the cold spread down. The race followed the seasons. Soon all of Wheeling would be spreading north again, and how was he to be sure that none of Wheeling's citizens might not turn up wherever he might go? He could be sure. That was the answer to that. All right, scratch immigration. What remained? He could, with Gala he guessed, live a solitary life on the fringes of cultivated land. They both had some skill at rummaging the old storehouses of the ancients, and there was still food and other commodities to be found. But even a wolf is gregarious by nature, and there were bleak hours in the night when Tropile found himself close to sobbing with his wife. At the first break of dawn he was up. Gala had fallen into a light and restless sleep. He called her awake. "We have to move," he said harshly. "Maybe they'll get up enough guts to follow us. I don't want them to find us." Silently, she got up. They rolled and tied the blankets she had brought. They ate quickly from the food she had brought. They made packs and put them on their shoulders and started to walk. One thing in their favor, they were moving fast, faster than any citizen was likely to follow. All the same, Tropile kept looking nervously behind him. They hurried north and east, and that was a mistake, because by noon they found themselves blocked by water. Once it had been a river. The melting of the polar ice caps that had submerged the coast of the old continents had drowned it out, and now it was salt water. But whatever it was impassable. They would have to skirt it westward until they found a bridge or a boat. "We can stop and eat," Tropile said grudgingly, trying not to despair. They slumped on the ground. It was warmer now. Tropile found himself getting drowsier. He jerked erect and stared around belligerently. Beside him, his wife was lying motionless, though her eyes were open, gazing at the sky. Tropile sighed and stretched out. A moment's rest, he promised himself, and then a quick bite to eat. Then onward. He was sound asleep when they spotted him. There was a flutter of the iron bird's wings from overhead. Tropile jumped up out of his sleep, awakening in panic. It was outside the possibility of belief, but there it was. In the sky over him, etched in black against the cloud, a helicopter, and men staring out of it, staring down at him. A helicopter? But there were no helicopters, or none that flew, if there had been fuel to fly them with, if any man had had the skill to make them fly. It was impossible. And yet there it was, and the men were looking at him, and the impossible great whirling thing was coming down, nearer. He began to run in the downward wash of air from the vanes, but it was no use. There were 3 men, and they were fresh, and he wasn't. He stopped, dropping to a fighter's crouch that was preset into the human body, ready to do battle. The men didn't want to fight. They laughed, and one of them said amiably, "Long past your bedtime, boy. Get in. We'll take you home." Tropile stood poised, hands half clenched. Take? Take you home, yeah. Where you belong, Tropile. Not back to Wheeling, if that's what you're worried about. Where you belong. Then Tropile understood. He got into the helicopter wonderingly. Home. So there was a home for such as he. He wasn't alone. He needn't keep his solitary self apart. He could be with his own kind. He remembered Gala Tropile and paused. One of the men said with a quick understanding, "Your wife? I think we saw her about a half a mile from here, heading back to Wheeling as fast as she could go." Tropile nodded. It was better, after all. Gala was no wolf, though he had tried his best to make her one. One of the men closed the door. Another did something with levers and wheels. The vanes whooshed around overhead. The helicopter bounced on its stiff-sprung landing legs and then rocked up and away. For the first time in his life, Glenn Tropile looked down on the land. They didn't fly high, but Glenn Tropile had never flown at all, and the 200 or 300 feet of air beneath him made him faint and queasy. They danced through the passes in the West Virginia hills, crossed icy streams and rivers, swung past old empty towns which no longer even had names of their own. They saw no one. It was something over 400 miles to where they were going, one of the men told him. They made it easily before dark. As Tropile walked through the town in the evening light, electricity flared white and violet in the buildings around him. Imagine, electricity was calories, and calories were to be hoarded. There were other walkers in the street. Their gait was not the economical shuffle with pendant arms. They burned energy visibly. They swung. They strode. It had been chiseled on his brain in earliest childhood that such walking was wrong, reprehensible, debilitating. It wasted calories. These people did not look debilitated, and they didn't seem to mind wasting calories. It was an ordinary sort of town, apparently named Princeton. It did not have the transient look to it of, say, Wheeling or Altoona or Gary, in Tropile's experience. It looked it looked permanent. Tropile had heard of a town called Princeton, but it happened that he had never passed through it, southwarding or northbound. There was no reason why he or anybody should or should not have. Still, there was a possibility, once he thought of it, that things were somehow so arranged that they should not, and maybe it was all on purpose. Like every town, it was underpopulated, but not so much so as most. Perhaps 1 living space in 5 was used, a high ratio. The man beside him was named Handel, one of the men from the helicopter. They hadn't talked much on the flight, and they didn't talk much now. "Eat first," Handel said, and took Tropile to a bright and busy sort of food stall. Only it wasn't a stall. It was a restaurant. This Handel, what to make of him? He should have been disgusting, nasty, an abomination. He had no manners whatever. He didn't know, or at least he didn't use, the 17 conventional gestures. He wouldn't let Tropile walk behind him or to his left, though he was easily 5 years Tropile's senior. When he ate, he ate. The sip of apprehension, the pause of first surfeit, and the thrice pre-offered chair meant nothing to him. He laughed when Tropile tried to give him the elder's portion. Cheerfully patronizing, this Menhendel said to Tropile, "That stuff's all right when you don't have anything better to do with your time. Those poor mutts don't. They die of boredom without their inky-pinky cults, and they didn't have the resources to do anything bigger. Yes, I know the gestures. 17 delicate ways of communicating emotions too refined for words. The hell with them, Tropile. I've got words. You'll learn them too." Tropile ate in silence, trying to think. A man arrived, threw himself in a chair, glanced curiously at Tropile, and said, "Handle, the Somerville Road. The creek backed up when it froze. Flooded bad. Ruined everything." Tropile ventured, "The flood ruined the road?" "The road? No. Say, you must be the fellow Handel went after. Tropile, that the name?" He leaned across the table and pumped Tropile's hand. "We had a road nicely blocked," he explained. "The flood washed it clean. Now we have to block it again." Handel said, "Take the tractor if you need it." The man nodded and left. Handel said, "Eat up, we're wasting time. About that road. We keep all entrances blocked up, see? Why let a lot of sheep in and out?" "Sheep?" "The opposite," said Handel, "of wolves. Take 10 billion people, and say that, out of every million of them, one, just one, is different. He has a talent for survival. Call him Wolf. 10,000 of him in a world of 10 billion. Squeeze them, freeze them, cut them down. Let old Rejoice in Messiahs loom in the terrifying sky, and so abduct the earth that the human race is decimated, fractioned, reduced to what is in comparison a bare handful of chilled, stunned survivors. There aren't 10 billion people in the world anymore. No, not by a factor of 1,000. Maybe there are as many as 10 million, more or less, rattling around in the space their enormous elder generation made for them. And of these 10 million, how many are Wolf? 10,000. "You understand, Tropile," said Handel. "We survive. I don't care what you call us. The sheep call us wolves. Me, I kind of call us supermen. We have the talent for survival." Tropile nodded and began to understand. "The way I survived in the House of 5 Regulations." Handel gave him a pitying look. "The way you survived 30 years of sheephood before that. Come on." It was a tour of inspection. They went into a building, big, looking like any other big and useful building of the ancients. Gray stone walls, windows with ragged spears of glass. Inside, though, it wasn't like the others. 2 sub-basements down, Tropile winced and turned away from the flood of violet light that poured out of a quartz bullseye on top of a squat steel cone. "Perfectly harmless, Tropile. You don't have to worry," Handel boomed. "Know what you're looking at? That's a fission reactor down there. Heat, power, all the power we need. Do you know what that means?" He stared solemnly down at the flaring violet light of the inspection port. "Come on," he said abruptly to Tropile. Another building, also big, also gray stone. A cracked inscription over the entrance read, "Oral Hall of Humanities." The sense shock this time was not light, it was sound. Hammering, screeching, rattling, rumbling. Men were doing noisy things with metal and machines. "Repair shop," Handel yelled. "See those machines? They belong to our man Innocent. We've salvaged them from every big factory ruin we could find. Give Innocent a piece of metal, any alloy, any shape, and one of those machines will change it into any other shape and damn near any other alloy. Drill it, cut it, plane it, weld it, smelt it, zone melt it, bond it. You tell him what to do, and he'll do it. We got the parts to make 6 tractors and 41 cars out of this shop. And we've got other shops. Aircraft in Farmingdale and Wichita. Armaments in Wilmington. Not that we can't make some armaments here. Innocent could build you a tank if he had to, complete with a 105mm gun." "What's a tank?" Tropile asked. Handel only looked at him and said, "Come on." Glenn Tropile's head spun dizzily, and all the spectacles merged and danced in his mind. They were incredible. All of them. Fission pile, machine shop, vehicular garage, aircraft hangar. There was a storeroom under the seats of the football stadium, and Tropile's head spun on his shoulders again when he tried to count the cases of coffee and canned soup and whiskey and beans. There was another storeroom, only this one was called an armory. It was filled with guns. Guns that could be loaded with cartridges, of which they had very many. Guns which, when you loaded them and pulled the trigger, would fire. Tropile said, remembering, "I saw a gun once that still had its firing pin, but it was rusted solid." "These work, Tropile," said Handel. "You can kill a man with them. Some of us have." "Kill? Get that sheep look out of your eyes, Tropile. What's the difference how you execute a criminal? And what's a criminal but someone who represents a danger to your world? We prefer a gun instead of a donation of spinal tap, because it's quicker, because it's less messy, and because we don't like to drink spinal fluid, no matter what imaginary therapeutic or symbolic value it has. You'll learn." But he didn't add, "Come on." They had arrived where they were going. It was a small room in the building that housed the armory, and it held, among other things, a rack of guns. "Sit down," said Handel, taking one of the guns out of the rack thoughtfully and handling it as the doomed Boyne had caressed his watch case. It was the latest pre-pyramid model rifle, anti-personnel, short range. It would not scatter a cluster of shots in a coffee can at more than 2.5 miles. "All right," said Handel, stroking the stock. "You've seen the works, Tropile. You've lived 30 years with sheep. You've seen what they have and what we have. I don't have to ask you to make a choice. I know what you choose. The only thing left is to tell you what we want from you." A faint pulsing began inside Glenn Tropile. "I expected we'd get to that." "Why not? We're not sheep. We don't act that way. Quid pro quo. Remember that. It saves time. You've seen the quid. Now we come to the quo." He leaned forward. "Tropile, what do you know about the pyramids?" "Nothing." Handel nodded. "Right. They're all around us, and our lives are beggared because of them, and we don't know why. We don't have the least idea what they are. Did you know that one of the sheep was translated in Wheeling when you left?" "Translated?" Tropile listened with his mouth open while Handel told him what had happened to Citizen Boyne. "So he didn't make the donation after all," Tropile said. "Might have been better if he had," said Handel. "Still, it gave you a chance to get away. We had heard, never mind how just yet, that Wheeling caught itself a wolf, so we came looking for you. But you were already gone." Tropile said, faintly annoyed, "You were very damn near too late." "Oh, no, Tropile," Handel assured him. "We're never too late. If you didn't have enough guts and integrity to get away from sheep, you're no wolf. Simple as that. But there's this translation. We know it happens, but we don't even know what it is. All we know, people disappear. There's a new sun in the sky every 5 years or so. Who makes it? The pyramids. How? We don't know that. Sometimes something floats around in the air and we call it an eye. It has something to do with translation. Something to do with the pyramids. What? We don't know that." "We don't know much about anything," interrupted Tropile, trying to hurry him along. "Not about the pyramids, no." Handel shook his head. "Hardly anybody has ever seen one, for that matter." "Hardly? You mean you have?" "Oh, yes. There's a pyramid on Mount Everest, you know. It's not just a story, it's true. I've been there, and it's there. At least it was there 5 years ago, right after the last sun recreation. I guess it hasn't moved. It just sits there." Tropile listened, marveling. To have seen a real pyramid. Almost he had thought of them as legends, contrived to account for such established physical facts as the eyes and translation, as children with a Santa Claus. But this incredible man had seen it. Somebody dropped an H-bomb on it way back, Handel continued. The only thing that happened is that now the North Pole has a crater. You can't move the pyramid. You can't hurt it. But it's alive. It's been there alive for a couple of 100 years. And that's about all we know about the pyramids, right? Right. Handel stood up. Tropile, that's what all this is all about. He gestured around him. Guns, tanks, airplanes. We want to know more. We're going to find out more, and then we're going to fight. There was a jarring note, and Tropile caught it, sniffing the air. Somehow, perhaps it was his subadrenals that told him, this very positive, very self-willed man was just the slightest bit unsure of himself. But Handel swept on, and Tropile, for a moment, forgot to be alert. We had a party up Mount Everest 5 years ago, Handel was saying. We didn't find out a thing. 5 years before that, and 5 years before that. Every time there's a sun, while it is still warm enough to give a party a chance to climb up the sides, we send a team up there. It's a rough job. We give it to the new boys, Tropile, like you. There it was. He was being invited to attack a pyramid. Tropile hesitated, delicately balanced, trying to get the feel of this negotiation. This was wolf against wolf. It was hard. There had to be an advantage. There is an advantage, Handel said out loud. Tropile jumped, but then he remembered. Wolf against wolf. Handel went on. What you get out of it is your life, in the first place. You understand you can't get out now. We don't want sheep meddling around. And in the second place, there's a considerable hope of gain. He stared at Tropile with the dreamer's eyes. We don't send parties up there for nothing, you know. We want to get something out of it. What we want is the Earth. The Earth? It reeked of madness. But this man wasn't mad. Someday, Tropile, it's going to be us against them. Never mind the sheep, they don't count. It's going to be pyramids and wolves, and the pyramids won't win. And then... It was enough to curdle the blood. This man was proposing to fight, and against the invulnerable, godlike pyramids. But he was glowing, and the fever was contagious. Tropile felt his own blood beginning to pound. Handel hadn't finished his, and then, but he didn't have to. The and then was obvious. And then the world takes up again from the day the wandering planet first came into view. And then we go back to our own solar system and an end to the 5-year cycle of frost and hunger. And then the wolves can rule a world worth ruling. It was a meretricious appeal, perhaps, but it could not be refused. Tropile was lost. He said, You can put away the gun, Handel. You've signed me up. The End of Wolfbane, Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The way to Mount Everest, Tropile glumly found, lay through supervising the colony's nursery school. It wasn't what he had expected, but it had the advantages that while his charges were learning, he was learning too. One jump ahead of the 3-year-olds, he found that the wolves, far from being predators on the sheep, existed with them in a far more complicated ecological relationship. There were wolves all through sheepdom. They leavened the dough of society. In barbarously simple prose, a primer said, The sons of the wolf are good at numbers and money. You and your friends play money games almost as soon as you can talk, and you can think in percentages and compound interest when you want to. Most people are not able to do this. True, thought Tropile subvocally, reading aloud to the tots. That was how it had been for him. Sheep are afraid of the sons of the wolf. Those of us who live among them are in constant danger of detection and death. Although ordinarily a wolf can take care of himself against any number of sheep. True, too. It is one of the most dangerous assignments a wolf can be given, to live among the sheep. Yet it is essential. Without us, they would die. Of stagnation, of rot, eventually of hunger. It didn't have to be spelled out any further. Sheep can't mend their own fences. The pros were horrifyingly bald, and the children were horrifyingly, he choked on the word, but managed to form it in his mind, competitive. The verbal taboos lingered, he found, after he had broken through the barriers of behavior. But it was distressing in a way. At an age when future citizens would have been learning their little pitcher ways, these children were learning to fight. The perennial argument about who would get to be Big Bill Zeckendorf when they played a strange game called Zeckendorf and Hilton sometimes ended in bloody noses. And nobody at all, meditated on connectivity. Tropile was warned not to do it himself. Handel said grimly, "We don't understand it, and we don't like what we don't understand. We're suspicious animals, Tropile. As the children grow older, we give them just enough practice so they can go into one meditation and get the feel of it, or pretend to, at any rate. If they have to pass as citizens, they'll need that much. But more than that, we do not allow." Allow? Somehow the word grated. Somehow his subadrenals began to pulse. Allow. We have our suspicions, and we know for a fact that sometimes people disappear when they meditate. We don't want to disappear. We think it is not a good thing to disappear. Don't meditate, Tropile. You hear? But later, Tropile had to argue the point. He picked a time when Handel was free, or as free as the man ever was. The whole adult colony had been out on what they used as a parade ground. It had once been a football field, Handel said. They had done their regular twice-a-week infantry drill, that being one of the prices one paid for living among the free, progressive wolves instead of the dull and tepid sheep. Tropile was mightily winded, but he cast himself on the ground near Handel, caught his breath, and said, "Handel, about meditation." "What about it?" "Well, perhaps you don't really grasp it." Tropile searched for words. He knew what he wanted to say. How could anything that felt as good as oneness be bad? And wasn't translation, after all, so rare as hardly to matter? But he wasn't sure he could get through to Handel in those terms. He tried. "When you meditate successfully, Handel, you're one with the universe. Do you know what I mean? There's no feeling like it. It's indescribable peace, beauty, harmony, repose." "It's the world's cheapest narcotic," Handel snorted. "Oh, now, really. And the world's cheapest religion. The stone-broke mutts can't afford gilded idols, so they use their own navels. That's all it is. They can't afford alcohol. They can't even afford the muscular exertion of deep breathing that would throw them into a state of hyperventilated oxygen drunkenness. Then what's left? Self-hypnosis, nothing else. It's all they can do, so they learn it, they define it as pleasant and good, and they're all fixed up." Tropile sighed. The man was so stubborn. Then a thought occurred to him, and he pushed himself up on his elbows. "Aren't you leaving something out? What is translation?" Handel glowered at him. "That's the part we don't understand." "But surely self-hypnosis doesn't account for—" "Surely it doesn't," Handel mimicked savagely. "All right, we don't understand it, and we're afraid of it. Kindly do not tell me translation is the supreme act of unwilling, total disavowal of duality, unison with the Brahman ground, or any such slop. You don't know what it is, and neither do we." He started to get up. "All we know is people vanish, and we want no part of it, so we don't meditate. None of us, including you." It was foolishness, this close-order drill. Could you defeat an unreachable Himalayan pyramid with a squad's right flanking maneuver? And yet it wasn't all foolish. Close order drill and 25,000 calorie a day diet began to put fat and flesh and muscle on Tropile's body, and something other than that on his mind. He had not lost the edge of his acquisitiveness, his drive, his whatever it was that made the difference between wolf and sheep. But he had gained something. Happiness? Well, if happiness is a sense of purpose and a hope that the purpose can be accomplished, then happiness. It was a feeling that had never existed in his life before. Always it had been a glandular compulsion to gain an advantage, and that was gone, or anyway almost gone, because it was permitted in the society which he now lived. Glenn Tropile sang as he putt-putted in his tractor, plowing the thawed Jersey fields. Squads right against the pyramids? Stiffly, Tropile stopped the tractor, slowed the diesel to a steady thump, and got off. It was hot, being midsummer of the 5-year calendar the pyramids had imposed. It was time for rest, and maybe something to eat. He sat in the shade of a tree, as farmers always had done, and opened his sandwich. He was only a mile or so from Princeton, but he might as well have been in limbo. There was no sign of any living human being but himself. The northering sheep didn't come near Princeton. It happened that way on purpose. He caught a glimpse of something moving, but when he stood up for a better look into the woods on the other side of the field, it was gone. Wolf? Real wolf, that is? It could have been a bear, for that matter. There was talk of wolves and bears around Princeton, and though Tropile knew that much of the talk was assiduously encouraged by men like Kendall, he also knew that some of it was true. As long as he was up, he gathered straw from the litter of last year's head-high grass, gathered sticks under the trees, built a small fire, and put water on to boil for coffee. Then he sat back and ate his sandwich, thinking. Maybe it was a promotion, going from the nursery school to labor in the fields. Or maybe it wasn't. Handel had promised him a place in the expedition that would, maybe, discover something new and great and helpful about the pyramids. And that might still come to pass because the expedition was far from ready to leave. Tropile munched his sandwiches thoughtfully. Now, why was the expedition so far from ready to leave? It was absolutely essential to get there in the warmest weather possible. Otherwise, Mount Everest was unclimbable. Generations of alpinists had proven that. That warmest weather was rapidly going by. And why were Handel and the Wolf Colony so insistent on building tanks, arming themselves with rifles, organizing in companies and squads? The H-bomb hadn't flustered the pyramid. What lesser weapon could? Uneasily, Tropile put a few more sticks on the fire, staring thoughtfully into the canteen cup of water. It was satisfyingly hot water, he noticed abstractly. The water was very near ready to boil. Half across the world, the pyramid in the Himalayas felt, or heard, or tasted a difference. Possibly the HF pulses that had gone endlessly weep, weep, weep were now going weep, beep, weep, beep. Possibly the electromagnetic taste of the lower than red was now spiced with a tang of beyond violet. Whatever the sign was, the pyramid recognized it. A part of the crop it tended was ready to harvest. The ripening bud had a name, of course, but names didn't matter to the pyramid. The man named Tropile didn't know he was ripening either. All that Tropile knew was that, for the first time in nearly a year, he had succeeded in catching each stage of the 9 perfect states of water coming to a boil in its purest form. It was well, it was like nothing that anyone but a water watcher could understand. He observed. He appreciated. He encompassed and absorbed the myriad subtle perfections of time, of shifting transparency, of sound, of distribution of ebulliency, of the faint, faint odor of steam. Complete, Glenn Tropile relaxed all his limbs and let his chin rest on his breastbone. It was, he thought with placid, crystalline perception, A rare and perfect opportunity for meditation. He thought of connectivity. Overhead, a shifting glassy flaw appeared in the thin, still air. There wasn't any thought of eyes in the erased palimpsest that was Glenn Tropile's mind. There wasn't any thought of pyramids or of wolves. The plowed field before him didn't exist. Even the water, merrily bubbling itself dry, was gone from his perception. He was beginning to meditate. Time passed, or stood still, for Tropile. There was no difference. There was no time. He found himself almost on the brink of understanding. Something snapped. An intruding bluebottle drone, maybe, or a twitching muscle. Partly, Tropile came back to reality. Almost, he glanced upward. Almost, he saw the eye. It didn't matter. The thing that really mattered, the only thing in the world, was all within his mind, and he was ready, he knew, to find it. Once more. Try harder. He let the mind-clearing, unanswerable question drift into his mind. If the sound of two hands together is a clapping, what is the sound of one hand? Gently he pawed at the question, the symbol of the futility of mind, and therefore the gateway to meditation. Unawareness of self was stealing deliciously over him. He was Glenn Tropile. He was more than that. He was the water boiling, and the boiling water was he. He was the gentle warmth of the fire, which was, yes, itself an arc of the sky. As each thing was each other thing, water was fire, and fire air. Tropile was the first simmering bubble, and the full roll of well-aged water was self, was more than self, was... The answer to the unanswerable question was becoming clearer and softer to him. And then, all at once, but not suddenly, for there was no time, it was not close, it was... The answer was his, was him. The arc of the sky was the answer, and the answer belonged to sky, to warmth, to all warmths that there are, and to all waters, and the answer was... Tropile vanished. The mild thunderclap that followed made the flames dance, and the column of steam fray, and then the fire was steady again, and so was the rising steam. But Tropile was gone. The end of Wolfbane, Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Handel plodded angrily through the high grass toward the dull throb of the diesel. Maybe it had been a mistake to take this Glenn Tropile into the colony. He was more citizen than wolf. No, cancel that, Handel thought. He was more wolf than citizen. But the wolf in him was tainted with sheep's blood. He competed like a wolf, but in spite of everything, he refused to give up some of his sheep's ways. Meditation. He had been cautioned against that. But had he given it up? He had not. If it had been entirely up to Handel, Glenn Tropile would have found himself back among the sheep, or dead. Fortunately for Tropile, it was not entirely up to Handel. The community of wolves was by no means a democracy, but the leader had a certain responsibility to his constituents. And the responsibility was this: he couldn't afford to be wrong. Like the old gray wolf who protected Mowgli, he had to defend his actions against attack. If he failed to defend, the pack would pull him down. And Innocent thought they needed Tropile, not in spite of the taint of the citizen that he bore, but because of it. Handel bawled, "Tropile! Tropile! Where are you?" There was only the wind and the thump of the diesel. It was enormously irritating. Handel had other things to do than to chase after Glenn Tropile. And where was he? There was the diesel idling wastefully. There, at the end of the patterned furrows Tropile had plowed. There was a small fire burning. And there was Tropile. Handel stopped, frozen, his mouth open, about to yell Tropile's name. It was Tropile, all right, staring with concentrated, oyster-eyed gaze at the fire and the little pot of water it boiled. Staring, meditating, and over his head, like a flawed glass in a pane, was the thing Handel feared most of all things on earth. It was an eye. Tropile was on the very verge of being translated, whatever that was. Time, maybe, to find out what that was. Handel ducked back into the shelter of the high grass, knelt, plucked his radio communicator from his pocket, urgently called. "Innocent! Innocent! Will somebody, for God's sake, put Innocent on?" Seconds passed. The voices answered. Then there was Innocent. "Innocent, listen. You want to catch Tropile in the act of meditation? All right, you've got him. The old wheat field, south end, under the elms around the creek. Get here fast, Innocent. There's an eye forming above him." Luck. Lucky that they were ready for this, and only by luck, because it was a helicopter that Innocent had patiently assembled for the attack on Everest that was ready now, loaded with instruments, planned to weigh and measure the aura around the pyramid, now at hand when they needed it. That was luck, but there was driving hurry involved too. It was only a matter of minutes before Handel heard the wobbling drone of the copter, saw the vanes fluttering low over the hedges, dropping to earth behind the elms. Handel raised himself cautiously and peered. Yes, Tropile was still there, and the eye still above him, but the noise of the helicopter had frayed the spell. Tropile stirred. The eye wavered and shook, but did not vanish. Thanking what passed for his god, Handel scurried circuitously around the elms and joined Innocent at the chopper. Innocent was furiously closing switches and pointing lenses. They saw Tropile sitting there, the eye growing larger and closer over his head. They had time, plenty of time. Oh, nearly a minute of time. They brought to bear on the silent and unknowing form of Glenn Tropile every instrument that the copter carried. They were waiting for Tropile to disappear. He did. Innocent and Handel hunched at the thunderclap as air rushed in to replace him. "We've got what you wanted," Handel said harshly. "Let's read some instruments." Throughout the translation, high tensile magnetic tape on a madly spinning drum had been hurling under 24 recording heads at 100 feet per second. Output to the recording heads had been from every kind of measuring device they had been able to conceive and build, all loaded on the helicopter for use on Mount Everest, all now pointed directly at Glenn Tropile. They had, at the instant of translation, readings from 1 microsecond to the next on the varying electric, gravitational, magnetic, radiant, and molecular state conditions in his vicinity. They got back to Innocent's workshop and the laboratory inside it in less than a minute, but it took hours of playing back the magnetic pulses into machines that turned them into scribed curves on coordinate paper before Innocent had anything resembling an answer. He said, "No mystery. I mean, no mystery except the speed. Want to know what happened to Tropile?" "I do," said Handel. "A pencil of electrostatic force maintained by a pinch effect bounced down the approximate azimuth of Everest. God knows how they handled the elevation, and charged him and the area positive. A big charge, clear off the scale. They parted company. He was bounced straight up. A meter off the ground, a correcting vector was applied. When last seen, he was headed fast in the direction of the pyramid's binary. Fast. So fast that I would guess he'll get there alive. It takes an appreciable time, a good part of a second, for his protein to coagulate enough to make him sick and then kill him. If the pyramids strip the charges off him immediately on arrival, as I should think they will, he'll live. Friction? Be damned to friction, Innocent said calmly. He carried a packet of air with him, and there was no friction. How? I don't know. How are they going to keep him alive in space without the charges that hold air? I don't know. If they don't maintain the charges, can they beat the speed of light? I don't know. I can tell you what happened. I can't tell you how. Handel stood up thoughtfully. It's something, he said grudgingly. It's more than we ever had, a complete reading at the instant of translation. We'll get more, Handel promised. Innocent, now that you know what to look for, go on looking for it. Keep every possible detection device monitoring 24 hours a day. Turn on everything you've got that'll find a sign of the imposed modulation. At any sign, or at somebody's hunch that there might be a sign, I'm to be called. If I'm eating, if I'm sleeping, if I'm enjoying with a woman, call me, you hear? Maybe you were right about Tropile. Maybe he did have some use. He might give the pyramids a bellyache. Innocent, flipping the magnetic tape drum to rewind, said thoughtfully, It's too bad they've got him. We could have used more readings. Too bad? Handel laughed sharply. This time they got themselves a wolf. The pyramids did have a wolf, a fact that did not matter in the least to them. It was not possible to know what mattered to a pyramid, except by inference. But it is possible to know that they had no way of telling wolf from citizen. The planet which was their home, Earth's old moon, was small, dark, atmosphereless, and waterless. It was completely built over, much of it with propulsion devices. In the old days, when technology had followed war, luxury, government, and leisure, the pyramid's sun had run out of steam, and about the same time they had run out of the components they imported from the neighboring planet. They used the last of their components to implement their stolid metaphysic of hauling and pushing. They pushed their planet. They knew where to push it. Every pyramid, as it stood, was a radio astronomy observatory, powerful and accurate beyond the wildest dreams of earthly radio astronomers. From this start, they built instruments to aid their naked senses. They went into a kind of hibernation, reducing their activity to a bare trickle, except for a small crew, and headed for Earth. They had every reason to believe they would find more components there, and they did. Tropile was one of them. The only thing that set him apart from the others was that he was the most recent to be stockpiled. The religion or vice or philosophy he practiced made it possible for him to be a component. Meditation derived from Zen Buddhism was a windfall for the pyramids, though of course they had no idea at all what lay behind it and did not care. They knew only that at certain times certain potential components became components, which were no longer merely potential, which were, in fact, ripe for harvesting. It was useful to them that the minds they cropped were utterly blank. It saved the trouble of blanking them. Tropile had been harvested at the moment his inhibiting conscious mind had been cleared. For the pyramids were not interested in him as an entity capable of will and conception. They used only the raw capacity of the human brain and its perceptors. They used Reshevsky's number, the gigantic, far more than astronomical expression that denotes the number of switching operations performed within the human brain. They used subception, the phenomenon by which the reasoning mind, uninhabited by consciousness, reacts directly to stimulus, shortcutting the cerebral sensors, avoiding the weighing of shall I or shan't I that precedes every conscious act. Harvested minds were components. It was not desirable that your bedroom wall switch have a mind of its own. If you turn the lights on, you want them on. So it was with the pyramids. A component was needed in the industrial complex, which transformed catabolism products into anabolism products. With long experience gained since their planetfall, pyramids received the tabula rasa that was Glenn Tropile. He arrived in one piece, wearing a blanket of air. Quick frozen mentally at the moment of inert blankness his meditation had granted him, the psychic drunkard's coma. He was cushioned on repellent charges as he plummeted down, and instantly stripped of surplus electrostatic charge. At this point, he was still human, only asleep. Annular fields they used for lifting and lowering seized him and moved him into a snug tank of nutrient fluid. There were many such tanks, ready and waiting. The tanks themselves could be moved, and the one containing Glenn Tropile did move, to a metabolism complex where there were many other tanks, all occupied. This was a warm room. The pyramids had wasted no energy on such foppish comforts in the first room. In this room, Glenn Tropile gradually resumed the appearance of life. His heart once again began to beat. Faint stirrings were visible in his chest as his habit-numbed lungs attempted to breathe. Gradually, the stirrings slowed and stopped. There was no need for that foppish comfort either. The nutrient fluid supplied all. Tropile was wired into circuit. The only literal wiring at first was a temporary one, a fine electrode aseptically introduced into the great nerve that leads to the rhinocephalon, the small brain, the area of the brain that contains the pleasure centers that motivate human behavior. More than 1,000 components had been spoiled and discarded before the pyramids had located the pleasure centers so exactly. While the component Tropile was being programmed, the wire rewarded him with minute pulses that made his body glow with animal satisfaction when he functioned correctly. That was all there was to it. After a time, the wire was withdrawn, but by then Tropile had learned his entire task. Conditioned reflexes had been established. They could be counted on for a long and useful life of the component. That life might be very long indeed. In the nutrient tank beside Tropile's, as it happened, lay a component with 8 legs and a chitinous fringe around its eyes. It had lain in such a tank for more than 125,000 terrestrial years. The component had been placed in operation. It opened its eyes and saw things. The sensory nerves in its limbs felt things. The muscles of its hands and toes operated things. Where was Glenn Tropile? He was there, all of him, but a zombie Tropile, bereft of will, emptied of memories. He was a machine, and part of a huger machine. His sex was the sex of a photoelectric cell. His politics were those of a transistor. His ambition, that of a mercury switch. He didn't know anything about sex, or fear, or hope. He only knew 2 things: input and output. Input, to him, was a display of small lights on a board before his vacant face. Also, the modulation of a loudspeaker's liquid-borne hum in each ear. Output, for him, was the dancing manipulation of certain buttons and keys, prompted by changes in input, and by nothing else. Between input and output, he lay in the tank, a human black box, which was capable of Radishevsky's number of switchings, and of nothing else. He had been programmed to accomplish a specific task, to shepherd a chemical called 3,7,12-trihydroxychloranic acid, present in the catabolic product of the pyramids, through a succession of more than 500 separate operations, until it emerged as a chemical which the pyramids were able to metabolize, called protoporphyrin 9. He was not the only component operating this task. There were several, each with its own program. The acid accumulated in great tanks a mile from him. He knew its concentration, heat, and pressure. He knew all of the impurities which would affect subsequent reactions. His fingers tapped, giving binary-coded signals to sluice gates to open for so many seconds, and then to close, for such an amount of solvent at such a temperature to flow in, for the agitators to agitate for just so long at just such a force. And if a trouble signal disrupted any one of the 517 major and minor operations, it, was set to decide among alternatives: scrap the batch in view of the flow conditions along the line, isolate and bypass the batch through a standby loop, immediate action to correct the malfunction. Without inhibiting intelligence, without the trammels of humanity on him, the intricate display board and the complex modulations of the 2 sound signals could be instantly taken in, evaluated, and given their share in the decision. Was it he still alive? The question has no meaning. It was working. It was an excellent machine, in fact, and the pyramids cared for it well. Its only consciousness, apart from the reflexive responses that were its program, was, well, call it the sound of one hand alone, which is to say zero, mindlessness, samadhi stupor. It continued to function for some time, until the required supply of protoporphyrin 9 had been exceeded by a sufficient factor of safety to make further processing unnecessary. That is, for some minutes or months. During that time it was happy. It had been programmed to be happy when there were no uncorrected malfunctions of the process. At the end of that time, it shut itself off, sent out a signal that the task was completed. Then it was laid aside in the analog of a deep freeze, to be reprogrammed when another component was needed. It was totally immaterial to the pyramids that this particular component had not been stamped from Citizen, but from Wolf. The end of Chapter 8 of Wolfbane. Chapter 9 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Roger Germain, of Wheeling, a citizen, contemplated his wife with growing concern. Possibly the events of the past few days had unhinged her reason, but he was nearly sure that she had eaten a portion of the evening meal secretly, in the serving room, before calling him to the table. He felt positive that it was only a temporary aberration. She was, after all, a citizeness, with all that implied. A creature like that Gallatropile, for example, someone like that might steal extra portions with craft and guile. You couldn't live with a wolf for years and not have some of it rub off on you, but not Citizeness Germain. There was a light, thrice-repeated tap on the door. Speak of the devil, thought Roger Germain, most appropriately, for it was the same Gallatropile. She entered, her head downcast, looking worn and, well, pretty. He began formally. I give you greetings, citizen. They're here, she interrupted in desperate haste. Germain blinked. Please, she begged, can't you do something? They're wolves. Citizeness Germain emitted a muted shriek. You may leave, citizeness, Germain told her shortly, already forming in his mind the words of gentle reproof he would later use. Now, what is all this talk of wolves? Gallatropile distractedly sat in the chair her hostess had vacated. We were running away, she babbled. Glenn, he was Wolf, you see, and he made me leave with him, after the house of the 5 regulations. We were a day's long march from Wheeling, and we stopped to rest, and there was an aircraft, citizen. An aircraft? Citizen Germain allowed himself a frown. Citizeness, it is not well to invent things which are not so. I saw it, citizen. There were men in it. One of them is here again. He came looking for me with another man, and I barely escaped him. I'm afraid. There is no cause for fear. Only an opportunity to appreciate, Citizen Germain said mechanically. It was what one told one's children. But within himself, he was finding it very hard to remain calm. That word, wolf, it was a destroyer of calm, an incitement to panic and hatred. He remembered Tropile well, and there was wolf, to be sure. The fact that Citizen Germain had doubted his wolfishness at first was powerful cause to be doubly convinced of it now. He had postponed the day of reckoning for an enemy of all the world, and there was enough secret guilt in his recollection to set his own heart thumping. Tell me exactly what happened, said Citizen Germain, in words that the stress of emotion had already made far less than graceful. Obediently, Gallatropile said, I was returning to my home after the evening meal, and Citizeness Puffin, she took me in after Citizen Tropile, after my husband was... I understand you made your home with her. Yes, she told me that 2 men had come to see me. They spoke badly, she said, and I was alarmed. I peered through the window of my home, and there they were. One of them had been in the aircraft I saw, and they flew away with my husband. It is a matter of seriousness, Citizen Germain admitted doubtfully. So then you came here to me? Yes, but they saw me, citizen, and I think they followed. You must protect me. I have no one else. If they be wolf, Germain said calmly, we will raise hue and cry against them. Now, will the citizeness remain here? I go forth to see these men. There was a graceless hammering on the door. Too late, said Gala Tropile in panic. They are here. Citizen Germain went through the ritual of greeting, of depreciating the ugliness and poverty of his home, of offering everything he owned to his visitors. It was the way to greet a stranger. The 2 men lacked both courtesy and wit, but they did make an attempt to comply with the minimal formal customs of introduction. He had to give them credit for that, and yet it was almost more alarming than if they had blustered and yelled. For he knew one of these men. He dredged the name out of his memory. It was Handel, the same man that had appeared in Wheeling the day Glenn Tropile had been scheduled to make the donation of Spinal Tap, and had broken free and escaped. He had inquired about Tropile of a good many people, Citizen Germain included, and even at the time, in the excitement of an amok, the wolf finding, and the translation in a single day, Germain had wondered at Handel's lack of breeding and airs. Now he wondered no longer. But the man made no overt act, and Citizen Germain postponed the raising of the hue and cry. It was not a thing to be done lightly. Gala Tropile is in this house, the man with Handel said bluntly. Citizen Germain managed the quirked smile. We have seen her, Germain. It's about her husband. He was with us for a while, and something happened. Ah, yes, the wolf. The man flushed and looked at Handel. Handel said loudly, The wolf. Sure, he's a wolf. But he's gone now, so you don't have to worry about that. Gone? Not just him, but 4 or 5 of us. There was a man named Innocent, and he's gone too. We need help, Germain. Something about Tropile. God knows how it is, but he started something. We want to talk to his wife and find out what we can about him. So, will you get her out of the back room where she's hiding and bring her here, please? Citizen Germain quivered. He bent over the ID bracelet that had once belonged to one PFC Joe Hartman, fingering it to hide his thoughts. He said at last, Perhaps you are right. Perhaps the citizeness is with my wife. If this be so, would it not be possible that she is fearful of those who once were with her husband? Handel laughed sourly. She isn't any more fearful than we are, Germain. I told you about this man Innocent who disappeared. He was a son of the wolf, you understand me? For that matter, he glanced at his companion, licked his lips, and changed his mind about what he had been going to say next. He was a wolf. Do you ever remember hearing of a wolf being translated before? Translated? Germain dropped the ID bracelet. But that's impossible, he cried, forgetting his manners completely. Oh, no, translation comes only to those who attain the moment of supreme detachment. You can be sure of that. I know. I've seen it with my own eyes. No wolf could possibly, at least 5 wolves did, Handel said grimly. Now you see what the trouble is? Tropile was translated. I saw that with my own eyes. The next day, Innocent. Within a week, 2 or 3 others. So we came down here, Germain, not because we like you people, not because we enjoy it, but because we're scared. What we want is to talk to Tropile's wife. You too, I guess. We want to talk to anybody who ever knew him. We want to find out everything there is to find out about Tropile and see if we can make any sense of the answers. Because maybe translation is the supreme objective of life to you people, Germain, but to us it's just one more way of dying. and we don't want to die." Citizen Germain bent and picked up his cherished identification bracelet and dropped it absently on a table. There was very much on his mind. He said at last, "That is strange. Shall I tell you another strange thing?" Handel, looking angry and baffled, nodded. Germain said, "There has been no translation here since the day the wolf Tropile escaped. But there have been eyes. I have seen them myself. He hesitated and shrugged. It has been disturbing. Some of my finest citizens have ceased to meditate. They have been worrying. So many eyes, and nobody taken. It is outside of all of our experience, and our customs have suffered. Politeness is dwindling among us, even in my own household." He coughed and went on. "No matter, but these eyes have come into every home. They have peered about, and no one has been taken. Why? Is it something to do with the translation of the wolves?" He stared hopelessly at his visitors. "All I know is that it is very strange, and therefore I am worried." "Then take us to Galatropile," said Handel. "We'll see what we can find out." Citizen Germain bowed. He cleared his throat and raised his voice just sufficiently to carry from one room to another. "Citizeness," he called. There was a pause. Then his wife appeared in the doorway, looking ruffled and ill at ease with her guest. "Will you ask if Citizeness Tropile will join us here?" he requested. His wife nodded. "She is resting. I will call her." They called her and questioned her for some time. She told them nothing. She had nothing to tell. The end of Chapter 9 of Wolfbane. Chapter 10 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Earth's binary, Glenn Tropile had been reprogrammed for a new task. The problem was navigation. Earth had been a disappointment to the pyramids. It was necessary to move rapidly to a more rewarding planet. The pyramids had taken Earth out past Pluto's orbit with a simple shove, slow and massive. It had been enough merely to approximate the direction in which they would want to go. There would be plenty of time for refinements, of course, later. But now the time for refinements had come, earlier than they might have expected. They had now time to travel. They knew where to, a star cluster reasonably sure to be rich in componentiferous planets. It was inherent in the nature of component mines that eventually they always played out. There were always more mines, though. If that had not been so, it would have been necessary, perhaps, to stock breed components against future needs. But it was easier to work the vein out and move on. Now the course had to be computed. There were such variables to be considered as motion of the star cluster, acceleration of the binary planet system, gravitational influence of every astronomical object in the island universe, without exception. Precise computation on this basis was obviously not practical. That was not an answer to the problem, since the time required would approach eternity as one of its parameters. It was possible to simplify the problem. Only the astronomical bodies which were relatively nearby need to be treated as individuals. Further away, the pyramids began to group them in small bunches, still further in large bunches, on to the point where the furthest and most numerous bodies were lumped together as vague gravitational noise, whose average intensity alone was required to know and to enter as a datum. And still no single component could handle even its own share of the problem, were the computer they formed to be kept within the range of permissible size. It was for this that the component which had been Tropile was taken out of storage. This was old stuff to the pyramids. They knew how to handle it. They broke the problem down to its essentials, separated even those into many parts. There was, for example, the subsection of one certain aspect of the logistical problem, which involved locating and procuring additional components to handle the load. Even that tiny specialization was too much for a single component, but fortunately, the pyramids had resources to bring to bear. The procedure in such cases was to hitch several components together. This was done. When the pyramids finished their neurosurgery, there floated in an oversized nutrient tank a thing like a great sea anemone. It was composed of 8 components, all human as it happened, arranged in a circle, facing inward, joined temple to temple, brain to brain. At their feet, where 16 eyes could see it, there was a display board to feed them their input. 16 hands each grasped a molded switch to handle the binary-coded output. There would be no storage of the output outside of the 8-component complex itself. It went as control signals to the electrostatic generators, funneled through the single pyramid on Mount Everest, which handled the task of component procurement. That is, of translation. The program was slow and thorough. Perhaps the pyramid which finally activated the octuple unit and went away was pleased with itself, not knowing that one of its components was Glentropile. Nirvana. It pervaded all. There was nothing outside of it. Nirvana. Glentropile floated in it as in the amniotic fluid around him. Nirvana. The sound of one hand. Floating oneness. There was an intrusion. Perfection is completed. By adding to it, it is destroyed. Duality struck like a thunderbolt. Oneness shattered. For Glentropile, it seemed as though his wife were screaming at him to wake up. He tried to. It was curiously difficult and painful. Timeless, poignant sadness. 5 years of sorrow over a lost love, compressed into a microsecond. It was always so, Tropile thought drowsily, awakening. It never lasts. What's the use of worrying over what always happens? Sudden shock and horror rocked him. This was no ordinary awakening, no ordinary thing at all. Nothing was as it ever had been before. Tropile opened his mouth and screamed, or thought he did, but there was only a hoarse, faint flutter in his eardrums. It was a moment when sanity might have gone, but there was one curious, mundane fact that saved him. He was holding something in his hands. He found that he could look at it, and it was a switch, a molded switch, mounted on a board, and he was holding one in each hand. It was little to cling to, but it at least was real. If his hands could be holding something, then there must be some reality somewhere. Tropile closed his eyes and managed to open them again. Yes, there was reality, too. He closed his eyes, and the light stopped. He opened them, and the light returned. Then perhaps he was not dead, as he had thought. Carefully, stumbling, his mind his only usable tool, he tried to make an estimate of his surroundings. He could hardly believe what he found. Item: he could scarcely move. Somehow he was bound by his feet and his head. How? He couldn't tell. Item: he was bent over, and he couldn't straighten. Why? Again he couldn't tell, but it was a fact. The great erecting muscles of his back answered his command, but his body would not move. Item: his eyes saw, but only in a small area. He couldn't move his head either. Still, he could see a few things. The switch in his hand, his feet, a sort of display of lights on a strangely circular board. The lights flickered and changed their pattern. Without thinking, he moved a switch. Why? Because it was right to move that switch. When a certain light flared green, a certain switch had to be thrown. Why? Well, when a certain light flared green, a certain switch... He abandoned that problem. Never mind why. What the devil was going on? Glentropile squinted about him like a mollusk peering out of its shell. There was another fact, the oddness of the seeing. What made it look so queer, he asked himself. He found an answer, but it required some time to take it in. He was seeing in a strange perspective. One looks out of 2 eyes. Close one eye, and the world is flat. Open it again, and there is a stereoscopic double. The salience of the picture leapt forward. the background retreats. So with the lights on the board. No, not exactly, but something like that, he thought. It was as though, he squinted and strained, well, as though he had never really seen before. As though for all his life he had only had one eye, and now he was strangely given two. His visual perception of the board was total. He could see all of it at once. It had no front or back. It was in the round. The natural thinking of it was without orientation. He engulfed and comprehended it as a unit. It had no secrets of shadow or silhouette. I think, Tropile mouthed slowly to himself, that I'm going crazy. But that was no explanation either. Mere insanity didn't account for what he saw. Then, he asked himself, was he in a state that was beyond nirvana? He remembered with an odd flash of guilt that he had been meditating, watching the stages of boiling water. All right, perhaps he had been translated. But what was this then? Were the meditators wrong in teaching that nirvana was the end? And yet righter than the wolves who dismissed meditation as a phenomenon wholly inside the skull and refused to discuss translation at all. That was a question for which he could find nothing approaching an answer. He turned away from it and looked at his hands. He could see them, too, in the round, he noted. He could see every wrinkle and pore in all 16 of them. 16 hands! That was the other moment when sanity might have gone. He closed his eyes. 16 eyes! No wonder the total perception. And after a while he opened them again. The hands were there, all 16 of them. Cautiously, Tropile selected a finger that seemed familiar in his memory. After a moment's thought, he flexed it. It bent. He selected another on a different hand this time. He could use any or all of the 16 hands. They were all his, all 16 of them. I appear, thought Tropile crazily, to be a sort of 8-branched snowflake. Each of my branches is a human body. He stirred and added another datum. I appear also to be in a tank of fluid, and yet I do not drown. There were certain deductions to be made from that. Either someone, the pyramids, had done something to his lungs, or else the fluid was as good an oxygenation medium as air, or both. Suddenly, a burst of data lights twinkled on the board below him. Instantly, and involuntarily, his 16 hands began working the switches, transmitting complex directions in a lightning-like stream of on-off clicks. Tropile relaxed and let it happen. He had no choice. The power that made it right to respond to the board made it impossible for his brain to concentrate while the response was going on. Perhaps, he thought drowsily, he would never have awakened at all if it had not been for the long period with no lights. But he was awake, and his consciousness began to explore as the task ended. He had had an opportunity to understand something of what was happening. He understood that he was now part of something larger than himself, beyond doubt something that served and belonged to the pyramids. His single brain not being large enough for the job, 7 others had been hooked in with it. But where were their personalities? Gone, he supposed. Presumably they had been citizens. Sons of the Wolf did not meditate, and therefore were not translated. Except for himself, he corrected wryly, remembering the meditation on rain clouds that had led him to... No, wait! Not rain clouds, but water. Tropile caught hold of himself and forced his mind to retrace that thought. He remembered the rain cloud meditation. It had been prompted by a particularly noble cumulus of the ancient ship type. And this was odd. Tropile had never been deeply interested in rain clouds, had never known even the secondary classifications of rain cloud types, and he knew that the ancient ship was of the 4th order of categories. It was a false memory. It was not his. Therefore, logically, it was someone else's memory, and being available to his own mind as the 14 other hands and eyes were available, It must belong to another branch of the snowflake. He turned his eyes down and tried to see which of the branches was his old body. He found it quickly with growing excitement. There was the left great toe of his body. He had injured it in boyhood, and there was no mistaking the way it was bent. Good. It was reassuring. He tried to feel the one particular body that led to that familiar toe. He succeeded, though not easily. After a time, he became more aware of that body, somewhat as a neurotic might become stomach conscious or heart conscious. But this was no neurosis. It was intentional exploration. Since that worked with some unease, he transferred his attention to another pair of feet and thought his way up from them. It was embarrassing. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to have breasts. For the first time in his life, he knew what it was like to have one's internal organs quite differently shaped and arranged, buttressed and stressed by different muscles. A very faint background feel of man's internal arrangements, never questioned unless something goes wrong with them and they start to hurt, was not at all like the faint background feel that a woman has inside her. And when he concentrated on that feel, it was no faint background to him. It was surprising and upsetting. He withdrew his attention, hoping that he would be able to. Gratefully, he became conscious of his own body again. He was still himself if he chose to be. Were the other 7 still themselves? He reached into his mind, all of it, all 8 separate intelligences that were combined within him. Is anybody there? He demanded. No answer, or nothing he could recognize as an answer. He drove harder, and there was still none. It was annoying. He resented it as bitterly, he remembered, as in the old days when he had first been learning the subtleties of rune appreciation. There had been a rune master, his name forgotten, who had been sometimes less than courteous, had driven hard. Another false memory. He withdrew and weighed it. Perhaps, he thought, that is part of the answer. These people, these other 7, would not be driven. The attempt to call them back to consciousness would have to be delicate. Then he drove hard. When he drove hard, it was painful. He remembered the instant violent agony of his own awakening, and they reacted with anguish. More gently, alert to vagrant memories, he combed the depths of the eightfold mind within him, reaching into the sleeping positions, touching, handling, sifting and associating, sorting. This memory of an old knife wound was from an amok. That was not the rain-cloud woman. That was a man, very aged. This faint recollection of a childhood fear of drowning. Was that she? It was. It fitted with the other recollection. The long detour on a road south toward the sun, around a river. The rain-cloud woman was the first to round out his mind, the first he communicated with. He was not surprised to find that, early in her life, she had feared that she might be Wolf. He reached out to her. It was almost magic, knowing the secret name of a person, so that then he was yours to command. But the secret name was more than that. It was the gestalt of the person. It was the sum of all data and experience, never available to another person until now. With her memories arranged at last in his own mind, he thought persuasively, Citizeness Alla Narova, will you awaken and speak with me? No answer, only a vague, troubled stirring. Gently he persisted. I know you well, Alla Narova. You sometimes thought you might be a daughter of the wolf, but never really believed it because you knew you loved your husband and thought wolves did not love. You loved rain clouds, too. It was when you stood at Beachy Head and saw the great cumulus that you went into meditation. And on, many times, coaxingly. Even so, it was not easy, but at last he began to reach her. Slowly she began to surface. Thoughts began faintly sounding in his mind, like echoes at first, his own thoughts bouncing back at him, a sort of mental nod of agreement. Yes, that is so. Then terror, with a shaking fear, a hysterical rush, Citizeness Alanarova came violently up to full consciousness and to panic. She was soundlessly screaming. The whole 8-branch figure quivered and twisted in its nutrient bath. The terrible storm raged in Tropile's own mind as fully as in hers, but he had the advantage of knowing what it was. He helped her. He fought it for the two of them. Soothing, explaining, calming. At last, her branch of the snowflake body retreated, sobbing for a spell. The storm was over. He talked to her in his mind, and she listened. She was incredulous, but there was no choice for her. She had to believe. Exhausted and passive, she asked finally, "What can we do? I wish I were dead." He told her, "You were never a coward before. Remember, Alanarova, I know you as nobody has ever known another human being before. That's the way you will know me. As for what we can do, we must begin by waking the others if we can." "If not?" "If not," Tropile replied grimly, "then we will think of something else." She was of tough stuff, he thought admiringly. When she had rested and absorbed things, her spirit was almost that of a wolf. She had very nearly been right about herself. Together they explored their twined members. They found through them exactly what task was theirs to do. They found how the electrostatic harvesting side of the pyramids was controlled, by and through them. They found what limitations there were, and what freedoms they owned. They reached into the other petals of the snowflake, reached past the linked components into the whole complex of electrostatic field generators and propulsion machinery, reached even past that into the great single function of the pyramids that lay beyond. The end of Chapter 10 of Wolfbane. Chapter 11 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Handel was on the ragged edge of breakdown, which was something new in his life. It was full, hot summer, and the hidden colony of wolves in Princeton should have been full of energy and life. The crops were growing on all the fields nearby. The drained storehouses were being replenished. The aircraft that had been so painfully rebuilt and fitted for the assault on Mount Everest were standing by, ready to be manned and to take off. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was going right. It looked as though there would be no expedition to Everest. 4 times now Handel had gathered his forces and been all ready. 4 times a key man of the expedition had vanished. Wolves don't vanish. And yet more than a score of them had. First Tropile, then Innocent, then 24 more by 1s and 2s. No one was immune. Take Innocent, for example. There was a man who was a wolf through and through. He was a doer, not a thinker. His skills were the skills of an artisan, a tinker, a jackleg mechanic. How could a man like that succumb to the pallid lure of meditation? But undeniably he had. It had reached the point where Handel himself was red-eyed and jumpy. He set curious alarms for himself, then enlisted help of others in the colony to avert the danger of translation from himself. When he went to bed at night, a lieutenant sat next to his bed, watchfully alert lest Handel, in that moment of reverie before sleep, fell into meditation and himself be translated. There was no hour of the day when Handel permitted himself to be alone, and his companions, or guards, were ordered to shake him awake, as violently as need be, at the first hint of an abstract look in the eyes or a reflective cast in the features. As time went on, Handel's self-imposed regime of constant alertness began to cost him heavily in lost rest and sleep. But the consequences of that were more and more occasions when the bodyguard shook him awake, less and less rest. He was very close to breakdown indeed. On a hot, wet morning, a few days after his useless expedition to see Citizen Germain in Wheeling, Handel ate a tasteless breakfast and, reeling with fatigue, set out on a tour of inspection of Princeton. Warm rain dripped from low clouds, but that was merely one more annoyance to Handel. He hardly noticed it. There were upward of 1,000 wolves in the community, and there were signs of worry on the faces of every one of them. Handel was not the only man in Princeton who had begun laying traps for himself as a result of the unprecedented disappearances. He was not the only one who was short of sleep. When one member in 40 disappears, the morale of the whole community receives a shattering blow. To Handel, it was clear, looking into the faces of his compatriots, that not only was it going to be nearly impossible to mount the planned assault on the pyramid on Everest this year, it was going to be unbearably difficult merely to keep the community going. The whole wolf pack was on the verge of panic. There was a confused shouting behind Handel. Groggily, he turned and looked. Half a dozen wolves were yelling and pointing at something in the wet, muggy air. It was an eye, hanging silent and featureless over the center of the street. Handel took a deep breath and mustered command of himself. "Frampton," he ordered one of his lieutenants, "get the helicopter with the instruments here. We'll take some more readings." Frampton opened his mouth, then looked more closely at Handel, and, instead, began to talk on his pocket radio. Handel knew what was in the man's mind. It was in his own, too. What was the use of more readings? From the time of Tropil's translation on, they had had a superfluity of instrument readings on the forces and auras that surrounded the eyes. Yes, and on translations themselves, too. Before Tropile, there had never been an eye seen in Princeton, much less an actual translation. But things were different now. Everything was different. Eyes roamed restlessly around day and night. Some of the men nearest the eye were picking up rocks and throwing them at the bobbing vortex in the air. Handel started to yell at them to stop, then changed his mind. The eye didn't seem to be affected. As he watched, one of the men scored a direct hit with a cobblestone. The stone went right through the eye without sound or effect. Why not let them work off some of their fears in direct action? There was a fluttering of vanes, and the copter with the instruments mounted on it came down in the middle of the street, between Handel and the eye. It was all very rapid from then on. The eye swooped toward Handel. He couldn't help it. He ducked. That was useless. But it was also unnecessary, for he saw in a second that it was only partly the motion of the eye toward him that made it loom larger. It was also that the eye itself was growing. An eye was perhaps the size of a football, as nearly as anyone could judge. This one got bigger, bigger. It was the size of a roc's egg, the size of a whale's blunt head. It stopped and hovered over the helicopter, while the man inside frantically pointed lenses and meters. Thundercrash. Not a man this time. Translation had gone beyond men. The whole helicopter vanished. Man, instruments, spinning vanes and all. Handel picked himself up, sweating, shocked beyond sleeplessness. The young man named Frampton said fearfully, "Handel, what do we do now?" "Do?" Handel stared at him absently. "Why, kill ourselves, I guess." He nodded soberly, as though he had at last attained the solution of a difficult problem. Then he sighed. "Well, one thing before that," he said. "I'm going to Wheeling. We wolves are licked. Maybe the citizens can help us now." Roget Germain of Wheeling, a citizen, received the message in the chambers that served him as a place of business. He had a visitor waiting for him at home. Germain was still citizen, and he could not quickly break off the pleasant and interminable discussion he was having with a prospective client over a potential business arrangement. He apologized for the interruption caused by the message the conventional 5 times, listened to his guest explain once more the plan he had come to propose in full, then turned his cupped hands toward himself in the gesture of denial of adequacy. It was the closest he could come to saying no. On the other side of the desk, the citizen who had come to propose an investment scheme immediately changed the subject by inviting Germain and his citizeness to the serious viewing, the invitation in the form of a rhymed couplet. He had wanted to transact his business very much, but he couldn't insist. Germain got out of the invitation by a conditional acceptance in proper form, and the man left, delayed only slightly by the 4 urgings to stay. Almost immediately, Germain dismissed his clerk and closed his office for the day by tying a triple knot in a length of red cord across the open door. When he got home, he found, as he had suspected, that the visitor was Handel. There had been much doubt in Citizen Germain's mind about Handel. The man had nearly admitted being Wolf, and how could a citizen overlook that? But in the excitement of Gallatropyle's translation, there had been no hue and cry. Germain had permitted the man to leave. And now? He reserved judgment. He found Handel distastefully sipping tea in the living room and attempting to keep up a formal conversation with Citizeness Germain. He rescued him, took him aside, closed the door, and waited. He was astonished at the change in the man. Before, Handel had been bouncy, aggressive, quick-moving, the very qualities least desired in a citizen, the mark of the son of the wolf. Now he was none of these things, but he looked no more like a citizen for all of that. He was haggard, tense. He said, with an absolute minimum of protocol, "Germain, the last time I saw you, there was a translation. Gallatropyle, remember?" "I remember," Citizen Germain said. Remember, it had hardly left his thoughts. "And you told me there had been others. Are they still going on?" Germain said, "There have been others." He was trying to speak directly to match this man Handel's speed and forcefulness. It was hardly good manners, but it occurred to Citizen Germain that there were times when manners, after all, were not the most important thing in the world. "There were 2 in the past few days. One was a woman, Citizeness Baird. Her husband's a teacher. She was viewing through glass with 4 or 5 other women at the time. She just disappeared. She was looking through a green prism at the time, if that helps." "I don't know if it helps or not. Who was the other one?" Germain shrugged. "A man named Harmain. No one saw it. But they heard the thunderclap, or something like a thunderclap, and he was missing." He thought for a moment. "It is a little unusual, I suppose. 2 in a week." Handel said roughly, "Listen, Germain, it isn't just 2. In the past 30 days, within the area around here and in one other place, there have been at least 50. In 2 places, do you understand? Here and in Princeton. The rest of the world, nothing much. A few translations here and there. But just in these 2 communities, 50. Does that make sense?" Citizen Germain thought. No. And I'll tell you something else. 3 of the, victims have been children under the age of 5. One was too young to walk. And the most recent translation wasn't a person at all. It was a helicopter. Now, figure that out, Germain. What's the explanation for translations?" Germain was gaping. "Why, you meditate, on connectivity. The idea is that once you've grasped the essential connectivity of all things, you become one with the cosmic whole. But I don't see how a baby or a machine—" "No, of course you don't. Remember Glenn Tropile?" "Naturally." "He's the link," Handel said grimly. "When he got translated, we thought it was a big help because he had the consideration to do it right in front of our eyes. We got enough readings to give us a clue as to what, physically speaking, translation is all about. That was the first real clue, and we thought he'd done us a favor. Now I'm not so sure." He leaned forward. "Every person I know who has been translated was someone Tropile knew. The 3 kids were in his class at the nursery school. We put him there for a while to keep him busy when he first came to us. 2 of the men he bunked with are gone. The mess boy who served him is gone. His wife is gone. Meditation? No, Germain. I know most of those people. Not a damn one of them would have spent a moment meditating on connectivity to save his life. And what do you make of that?" Swallowing hard, Germain said, "I just remembered. The man Harmain?" "What about him?" "The one who was translated last week. He also knew Tropile. He was the keeper of the House of Five Regulations when Tropile was there." "You see? I'll bet the woman knew Tropile too." Haendl got up fretfully, pacing around. "Here's the thing, Germain. I'm licked. You know what I am, don't you?" Germain said levelly, "I believe you to be Wolf." "You believe right. That doesn't matter anymore. You don't like wolves. Well, I don't like you. But this thing is too big for me to care about that anymore. Tropile has started something happening, and what the end of it is going to be, I can't tell. But I know this: we're not safe, either of us. Maybe you still think translation is a fulfillment. I don't. It scares me. And it's going to happen to me. And to you. It's going to happen to everybody who ever had anything to do with Glenn Tropile, unless we can somehow stop it. And I don't know how. Will you help me?" Germain tried not to tremble when all his buried fears screamed wolf, said honestly, "I'll have to sleep on it." Haendl looked at him for a moment. Then he shrugged. Almost to himself, he said, "Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we can't do anything about it anyhow. All right, I'll come back in the morning, and if you've made up your mind to help, we'll start trying to make plans. And if you made up your mind the other way, well, I guess I'll have to fight off a few citizens. Not that I mind that." Germain looked up and bowed. He began the ritual of the four urgings. "Spare me that," Haendl growled. "Meanwhile, Germain, if I were you, I wouldn't make any long-range plans. You may not be here to carry them out." Germain asked thoughtfully, "And if you were you?" "I'm not making any," Haendl said grimly. Citizen Germain, feeling utterly tainted with the scent of the wolf in his home, tossed in his bed, sleepless. His eyes were wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. He could hear his wife's decorous breathing at the foot of the bed, soft and regular. It should have been lulling him to sleep. It was not. Sleep was very far away. Germain was a brave enough man, as courage is measured among citizens. That is to say, he had never been afraid, though it was true that there had been very little occasion. But he was afraid now. He didn't want to be translated. The wolf, Haendl, had put his finger on it. Perhaps you still think translation is a fulfillment. Translation, the reward of meditation, the gift bestowed on only a handful of gloriously transfigured persons. That was one thing. But the sort of translation that was now involved was nothing like that. Not if it happened to children, not if it happened to Gala Tropile, not if it happened to a machine. And Glenn Tropile was involved in it. Germain turned restlessly. If people who knew Glenn Tropile were likely to be translated, and the people who meditated on connectivity were likely to be translated, then people who knew Glenn Tropile and didn't want to be translated had better not meditate on connectivity. It was very difficult not to think of connectivity. Endlessly he calculated sums in arithmetic in his mind, reciting the 5 regulations, composed greeting poems and verses on viewing, and endlessly he came back to Tropile, to translation, to connectivity. He didn't want to be translated, but still the thought had a certain lure. What was it like? Did it hurt? Well, probably not, he speculated. It was very fast, according to Haendl's report, if you could believe what an admitted son of the wolf reported. But Germain had to. Well, if it was fast, at that kind of speed, he thought, perhaps you would die instantly. Maybe Tropile was dead. Was that possible? No, it didn't seem so. After all, there was the fact of the connection between Tropile and so many of the recently translated. What was the connection there? Or, generalizing, What connections were involved in... He rescued himself from the dread word and summoned up the first image that came to mind. It happened to be Tropile's wife, Gala Tropile, who had disappeared herself in this very room. Gala Tropile. He stuck close to the thought of her, a little pleased with himself. That was the trick of not thinking of connectivity, to think so hard and fully of something else as to leave no room in the mind for the unwanted thought. He pictured every line in her face, every wave of her stringy hair. It was very easy that way. He was pleased. The end of chapter 11 of Wolfbane. Chapter 12 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Mount Everest, the sullen stream of off and on responses that was mind to the pyramids had taken note of the new input signal. It was not a critical mind. Its only curiosity was a restless urge to shove and haul, and there was no shove and haul about what to it was perhaps the analog of a man's hunger pang. The input signal said, "Do thus." It obeyed. Call it craving for a new flavor. Where once it had patiently waited for the state that citizens knew as meditation on connectivity, and the pyramid itself perhaps knew as a stage of ripeness in the fruits of its wristwatch mine, now it wanted a different taste. Unripe, overripe, at any rate different. Accordingly, the high-frequency weep-weep changed in tempo and in key, and the bouncing echoes changed, and there was a ripe one to be plucked. Its name was Innocent. And there another, Gala Tropile. And another, oh, many others. A baby from Tropile's nursery school, and the wheeling jailer, and a woman Tropile had once coveted on the street. Once the ruddy starch to sugar mark of ripeness had been what human beings called meditation on connectivity, and the pyramids knew as a convenient blankness. Now the sign was sort of empathy with the component named Tropile. It didn't matter to the pyramid on Mount Everest. It swung its electrostatic scythe, and call them Tropile topes, were harvested. It did not occur to the pyramid on Mount Everest that a component might be directing its actions. How could it? Perhaps the pyramid on Mount Everest wondered, if it knew how to wonder, when it noticed that different criteria were involved in selecting components these days. If it knew how to notice, surely even a pyramid might wonder when, without warning or explanation, its orders were changed. Not merely to harvest a different sort of component, but to drag along with the flesh and blood needful parts a clanking assortment of machinery and metal, as began to happen. Machines? Why would the pyramids need to translate machines? But why, on the other hand, would a pyramid bother to question a directive, even if it were able to? In any case, it didn't. It swung its scythe and gathered in what it was called to gather in. Men sometimes eat green fruit and come to regret it. Was it the same with pyramids? And Citizen Germain fell into the unsuspected trap. Avoiding connectivity, he thought of Glenn Tropile, and the unfelt HF pulses found him out. He didn't see the eye that formed above him. He didn't feel the gathering of forces that formed his trap. He didn't know that he was seized, charged, catapulted through space, caught, halted, and drained. It happened too fast. One moment he was in bed. The next moment he was elsewhere. There wasn't anything in between. It had happened to hundreds of thousands of components before him, but for Citizen Germain, what happened was in some ways different. He was not embalmed in nutrient fluid, formed and programmed to take his part in the pyramid structure, for he had not been selected by the pyramid, but by a single wild component, Tropile. He arrived conscious, awake, and able to move. He stood up in the red-lit chamber. Vast, thundering clashes of metal buffeted his ears. Heat sprang little fonts of perspiration on his skin. It was too much to take in at once. Oily-skinned madmen, naked, were capering and shouting at him. It took him a moment to realize they were not devils. This was not hell. He was not dead. "This way," they were bawling at him. "Come on, hurry it up." He reeled, following their directions, across an unpleasantly warm floor, staggering and falling. The binary planet was a quarter denser than Earth, until he got his balance. The capering madmen led him through a door, a sphincter, or trap. It was not like anything he had ever seen, but it was a portal of a sort, and on the other side of it was something closer to sanity. It was another room, and though the light was still red, it was paler, calmer red, and the thundering ironmongery was a wall away. The madmen were naked, yes, but they were not mad. The oil on their skin was only the sheen of sweat. Where am I?" he gasped. Two voices, perhaps three or four, were all trying at once. He could make no sense of it. Citizen Germain looked about him. He was in a sort of chamber that formed a part of a machine that existed for the unknown purposes of the pyramids on the binary planet. And he was alive. And not even alone. He had crossed more than 1,000,000 miles of space without feeling a thing. But when what the naked men were saying began to penetrate, the walls lurched around him. It was true. He had been translated. He looked dazedly down at his own bare body and around at the room, and then he realized they were still talking. "When you get your bearings, feel all right now? Come on, citizen, snap out of it." Germain blinked. Another voice was saying peevishly, "Tropile's got to find some other way to bring them in. That foundry wasn't meant for human beings. Look at the shape this one's in. Sometime somebody's going to come in, and we won't spot him in time. And fit." The first voice said, "Can't be helped. Hey, are you all right?" Citizen Germain looked at the naked man in front of him and took a deep breath of hot, sour air. "Of course I'm all right," he said. The naked man was Haendl. The Tropile pedal said to the Alla-Nerova pedal, "Got another one. It's Citizen Germain." The pedal fluttered feebly in soundless laughter. The Alla-Nerova pedal said, "Glenn, come back. The whole propulsion pneuma just went out of circuit." Tropile pulled his attention away from his human acquisitions in the chamber off the foundry and allowed himself to fuse with the woman personality. Together, they reached out and explored along the pathways they had laboriously traced. The propulsion pneuma was a complex of navigation computers, drive generators, course vectoring units that their own unit had been originally part of, until Glenn Tropile, by waking its components, had managed to divert it for a purpose of his own. The two of them reached out into it. Dead end. It was out of circuit, as Alla-Nerova had said. One whole limb of their body, their new jointly tenanted body that spanned the whole planet and reached across space to Earth, had been lopped off. Quick, they separated, traced separate paths. They came together again. Still dead end. The dyad that was Tropile and the woman reached out to touch the others in the snowflake and communicate, not in words, not in anything as slow and as opaque as words. The pyramids have lopped off another circuit. The compound personalities of the snowflake considered its course of action, reached its decision, acted. Quick. 3 of the other members of the snowflake darted out of the collective unit and went about isolating and tracing the exact area that had been affected. Tropile, we expected this. They couldn't help noticing sooner or later that something was going wrong. Alla-Nerova, but Glenn, suppose they cut us out of circuit. We're stuck here. We can't move. We can't get out of the tanks. If they know that we are the source of their troubles, Tropile, let them know. That's what we've got the others here for. He was cocky now, self-assured, fighting. For the first time in his life, he was free to fight, to let his wolf blood strive to the utmost. And he knew what he was going to fight for. This wasn't a matter of Haendl's pitiful tanks and carbines against the invulnerable pyramids. This was the invulnerability of the whole pyramid system turned against the pyramids. It was a warning, the fact that the pyramids had become alert to danger and had begun cutting sections of their planetary communication system out of the main circuit. But as a warning, it didn't frighten Tropile, it only spurred him to action. Quick, quick, he and the woman personality dissolved, sped away. Figuratively, they sought out the most restive components they could find, shook them by the shoulder, tried to wake them. Actually, well, what is actually? The physical fact was, surely, that they didn't move at all, for they were bound to their tank and to the surgical joinings, each to the other, at their temples. No crawling child in a playpen was more helplessly confined than Tropile and Alanarova and the others. And yet no human being had ever been more free. Regard that imbecile servant of every man, the thermostat. He runs the furnace in every man's house. He measures the doneness of every man's breakfast toast. He valves the cooling fluid through the radiator of every man's car. If every man's house stays too hot or too cold, the man swears at the lackwit switch and maybe buys a new one to plug in. But he never thinks that his thermostat might be plotting against him. Thermostat to man equals man to pyramid. Only that, and nothing more. It was not in the nature of the pyramid to think that its components, once installed, could reprogram themselves. No component ever had. But before Glenn Tropile, no component had been Wolf. When Tropile found himself, he found others. They were men and women, real persons, with gonads and dreams. They had been caught at the moment of blankness, yes, and frozen into that shape, true, but they were palimpsest personalities on which the pyramids had programmed their duties. Underneath the pyramid's Kabbalistic scrawl, the men and women still remained. They had only to be reached. Tropile and Alanarova reached them, one at a time, then by scores. The pyramids made that possible. The network of communication that they had created for their own purposes encompassed every cell of the race and all its works. Tropile reached out from his floating snowflake and went where he wished, anywhere within the binary planet, to the brooding pyramid on Earth, through the eyes, wherever he chose on the Earth's surface. Physically, he was scarcely able to move a muscle, but oh, the soaring range of his mind and vision. Citizen Germain was past shock, but just the same it was uncomfortable to be in a room with several dozen other people, all of them naked. Uncomfortable. Once it would have been brain-shattering. For a citizen to see his own citizeness unclothed was gross lechery. To be part of a mixed and bare-skinned group was unthinkable, or had been. Now it only made him uneasy. He said numbly to Hendel, "Citizen, I pray you tell me what sort of place this is." "Later," said Hendel gruffly, and led him out of the way. "Stay put," he advised. "We're busy." And that was true. Something was going on, but Citizen Germain couldn't make out exactly what it was. The naked people were worrying out a distribution of some sort of supplies. There were tools, and there were also what looked to Citizen Germain's unsophisticated eyes very much like guns. Guns? It was foolish to think they were guns, Citizen Germain told himself strongly. Nobody had guns. He touched the floor with an exploratory hand. It was warm, and it shook with a nameless, distant vibration. He shuddered. Hendel came back. Yes, they were guns. Hendel was carrying one. "Ours," he crowed. "That Tropile must have looted our armory at Princeton. By the looks of what here, I doubt if he left a single round of ammunition. What the hell, they're more use here. But what are we going to do with guns?" Hendel looked at him with a savage amusement. "Shoot." Citizen Germain said, "Please, citizen, tell me what this is all about." Hendel sat down next to him on the warm, quivering floor and began fitting cartridges into a clip. "We're fighting," he explained gleefully. "Tropile did it all. You've been shanghaied, and so have all the rest of us. Tropile's alive. He's part of the Pyramid Communications Network. Don't ask me how, but he's there, and he has been hauling men and weapons and God knows what all the way up from Earth. You're on the binary planet now, you know, and we're going to bust things up so the pyramids will never be able to put them back together again. Understand? Well, it doesn't matter if you don't. All you have to understand is that when I tell you to shoot this gun, you shoot. Nimbly, Citizen Germain took the unfamiliar stock and barrel into his hands. Muscles he had forgotten he owned straightened the limp curve of his back, squared his shoulders, and thrust out his chest. It had been many generations since any of Citizen Germain's people had known the feeling of being an armed man. A naked woman with wild hair and full, soft figure came toward them, jiggling in a way that agonized Citizen Germain. He dropped his eyes to his gun and kept them there. She cried, "Orders from Tropile! We've got to form a party and blow something up." Handel demanded, "Such as what?" "I don't know what, I only know where. We've got a guide, and Tropile particularly asked for you, Handel. He said you'd enjoy it." And enjoy it Handel did. Anticipation was all over his face. They formed a party of a dozen. They armed themselves with the guns Tropile had levitated from the bulging warehouse at Princeton. They supplied themselves with gray metal cans of something that Handel said were explosives, and with fuses and detonators to match, and they set off with their guide. A guide. It was a shambling, fearsome monster. When Citizen Germain saw it, he had to fight an almost irresistible temptation to be ill. Even the bare skin around him no longer mattered. This new horror canceled them out. What? He strangled, pointing. Handel laughed raucously. "That's Joey." "What's Joey?" "He works for us," said Handel, grinning. Joey was neither human nor beast. It was not pyramid. It was nothing Citizen Germain had ever seen or imagined before. It crouched on many jointed limbs, and even so was twice the height of a man. Its ropey arms and legs were covered with fine chitinous spines, laid on as close as hairs in a pelt, and sharp as thorns. There was a layer of chitin around its reddish eyes. What was more horrible than all, it spoke. It said squeakily, "You all ready? Come on, snap it up. The pyramids have got something big building up, and we've got to squash it." Citizen Germain whispered feverishly to Handel, "That voice, it sounds odd, yes, but isn't it Tropile's voice?" "Sure it is. That's what old Joey is good for," said Handel. "Tropile says he's telepathic, whatever that is. Makes it handy for us." And it did. Telepathy was the alien's very special use to Glenn Tropile. For what Joey was, in fact, was another component from a previous wristwatch mine. Joey's planet had once circled a star never visible from Earth. His home air was thin, and his home sunlight was weak, and in consequence his race had developed a species of telepathy for communicating at long range. This was handy for the pyramids, because it simplified the wiring. And it was equally handy for Glenn Tropile once he managed to wake the creature. With its permission, he could use its body as a sort of walkie-talkie in directing the tactics of his Shanghaied army. That permission was very readily given. Joey remembered what the pyramids had done to its own planet. "Come on," ordered Joey in Tropile's filtered voice, and they hastened through a straight and achingly cramped tunnel in single file toward what Tropile said was their target. They had nearly reached it when, abruptly, there was a thundering of explosions ahead. The party stopped, looking at each other, and got ready to move on more slowly. At last it had started. The pyramids were beginning to fight back. The end of Chapter 12 of Wolfbane. Chapter 13 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Citizeness Rogette Germain, widow, woke from sleep like a well-mannered cat on the narrow lower third of the bed that her training had taught her to occupy, though it had been some days since her husband's translation had emptied the citizen's two-thirds permanently. Someone had tapped gently on her door. "I'm awake," she called, in a voice just sufficient to carry. A quiet voice said, "Citizeness, there is an exceptional opportunity to appreciate this morning. Come, see, if you will, and I ask forgiveness for waking you." She recognized the voice. It was the wife of one of her neighbors. The citizeness made the appropriate reply, combining forgiveness and gratitude. She dressed rapidly, but with appropriate pauses for reflection and calm, and stepped out into the street. It was not yet daylight. Overhead, great sheets of soundless lightnings flared. Inside Citizeness Germain, long unfelt emotions stirred. There was something that was very like terror, and something that was akin to love. This was a generation that had never seen the aurora, for the ricocheting electron beams that caused it could not span the increasing distance between the orphaned Earth and its primary, old soul, and the small rekindled suns the pyramids made were far too puny. Under the sleeting aurora, small knots of citizens stood about the street, their faces turned up to the sky and illuminated by the distant light. It was truly an exceptional opportunity to appreciate, and they were all making the most of it. Conscientiously, Citizeness Germain sought out another viewer with whom to exchange comments on the spectacle above. "It is more bright than meteors," she said judiciously, "and lovelier than the freshly kindled sun." "Sure," said the woman. Citizeness Germain jolted, looking more closely. It was the Tropile woman. Gala? Was that her name? And what sort of a name was that? But it fitted her well. She was the one who had been wife to Wolf, and, more likely than not, part Wolf herself. Still, the case was not proved. Citizeness Germain said honestly, "I have never seen a sight to compare with this in all my life." Gala Tropile said indifferently, "Yeah, funny things are happening all the time these days, have you noticed? Ever since Glenn turned out to be—" She stopped. Citizeness Germain rapidly diagnosed her embarrassment and acted to cover it up. "That is so. I have seen eyes 100 times, and yet has there been a translation with the eyes? No. But there have been translations. It is queer." "I suppose so," Gala Tropile said, looking upward at the display. She sighed. Over their heads, a formed eye was drifting slowly about, but neither of the women noticed it. The shifting lights in the sky obscured it. "I wonder what causes that stuff," Gala Tropile said idly. Citizeness Germain made no attempt to answer. It was not the sort of question that would normally have occurred to her, and therefore not a sort to which she could reply. Moreover, it was not the question closest to Gala Tropile's heart at the moment, nor, for that matter, the question closest to Citizeness Germain's. The question that underlay the thought of both was, "I wonder what happened to my husband." It was strange, but true, that the answers to all their questions were very nearly the same. The Alanarova mind said sharply, "Glenn, come back." Tropile withdrew from scanning the distant dark street. He laughed soundlessly. "I was watching my wife. God, we're giving them fits down there. The pyramids must be churning things up, too. The sky is full of auroral displays. Looks like there's plenty of HF bouncing around the atmosphere." "Pay attention," the Alanarova mind commanded. "All right." Obediently, Tropile returned to the war he was waging. It was a strange conflict, strangely fought. Tropile's mind searched the abysses and tunnels of the pyramid planet, and what he sensed or saw was immediately communicated to all of the awakened components who were his allies. It was a godlike position. Was he sane? There was no knowing. Sanity no longer meant anything to Tropile. He was beyond such human affairs as lunacy, or its reverse. An insane man is one who is out of joint with his environment. Tropile was himself his environment. His mind encompassed 2 planets and the space between. He saw with 1,000 eyes. He worked with 1,000 hands. And he struck mighty blows. The weakness of a network that reaches everywhere is that it is everywhere vulnerable. If a teletype repeater in Omaha garbles a single digit, printing units in Atlanta and Bangor will type out errors. Tropile, by striking at the pyramid's net at 1,000 points, garbled their communications and made them nearly useless. More, he took the pyramid's network for his own. The Tropile pulse sped through the neuron glides of the pyramid net, and what it encountered, it mastered, and what it mastered, it changed. The pyramids discovered that they had been attacked. Frantically, if they could feel frenzy, the pyramids replaced components. The Tropile pulse woke the new ones. Unbelievingly, did they know how to believe? The pyramids isolated contaminated circuits. The Tropile pulse bypassed them. Desperately, or joyously, or uffishly, one term fits exactly as well as another, the pyramids returned to shove and haul, and there was more destruction, and some components died. But by then the components had reprogrammed themselves. The first job had been the matter of finding hands for the Tropile brain to work with. Bring hands in, then, Tropile commanded the pyramid's network, and obediently it was done. The translation mechanism, the electrostatic scythe that had harvested so many crops from the wristwatch mines, suffered a change and went to work not for the pickers, but for the fruit. The essential change in the operation of that particular pneuma had been simple. First, to harvest, or translate, the men and women Tropile wanted as fighters instead of the meditative citizen kind. Second, to divert the new arrivals to where they would not go straight to the deep freeze. It happened that the only alternative space Tropile could find was a sort of foundry that was nearly hell, but that was only a detail. The important thing was that the new helpers were arriving, with minds of their own and the capacity to move and act. Then Tropile needed to communicate with them. He found the alien, ropey-limbed component whose name vaguely approached Joey. Joey's limited sense of telepathy was needed, and so, with enormous difficulty, Tropile and Alanarova combined, managed to reach and wake it. And so he had an army, captured humans for troops, and awakened Joey for liaison. Tropile was the lord of 2 worlds. Not only the pyramids were under his thumb, but his own fellow humans, whom he had drafted into his service. They ate when a captured circuit he controlled fed synthetic mush into troughs for them. They breathed because a captured circuit he directed created air. They would return to Earth when, and only when, a captured circuit he operated sent them home. Sane? By what standards? And what difference did it make? The end of Chapter 13 of Wolfbane. Chapter 14 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With a series of grinding shocks, like an enormous earthquake fault relieving a strain, the pyramids began to fight back. Tropile, the Alanarova mind called urgently. Tropile flashed to the trouble spot. Through eyes that were not his own, Tropile scanned the honeycombed world of the pyramids. There was an area where huge and ancient vehicles lay covered with the slow dust of centuries, and the vehicles were beginning to move. Caterpillar-treaded hauling machines were loading themselves with what Tropile judged to be quickly synthesized explosives. Almost forgotten wheeled vehicles were creeping mindlessly out of nearly abandoned storage sections, and lumbering painfully along the tunnels of the planet. Coming toward us, Tropile diagnosed dispassionately. Alanarova queried, "They mean to fight?" "Of course. You see if you can penetrate the circuit that controls them. Already he was flashing away. I'll get the boys through Joey." It was queer looking through the eyes of the alien they called Joey. Colors were all wrong. Perspective was flat. But he could see, though cloudily. He saw Hendel joyously fitting a bayonet, to a rifle. He saw Citizen Germain, naked but square-shouldered, puffing valiantly along in the rear. Tropile said through the strange vocal cords that belonged to the alien, "You'll have to hurry." Strange to speak in words again. "The pyramids are heading toward the chambers where the components are kept. I think they mean to kill us." He flashed away, located the area, flashed back. "You'll have to go without me. I mean, without Joey me. The only way I can see to get there is through a narrow little ventilation tunnel. I guess ventilation is what it's for." Quickly, but against the familiar race of thought, it seemed agonizingly slow, he laid out the route for them and left. It was up to them. Watching from a dozen viewpoints at once, he saw the slow creep of the pyramid's machines and the slower intersection march of his little army. He studied the alternative cross routes and contrived to block some of them by interfering with the control circuits of the emergency doors and portals. But there were some circuits he could not control. The pyramids had withdrawn whole sections of their net, and areas of the planet were now hidden from him entirely. Sections of the vast maintenance propulsion manufacturing complex were no longer subject to his interference or control. It would be, Tropile thought dispassionately, a rather close thing. The chances were perhaps 6 out of 10 that his hastily assembled task force would be able to intersect the convoy of automatic machines before it could reach the racks of nutrient tanks. And if they were not in time, Tropile almost laughed out loud, if that had been possible. Why, then his body would be destroyed. How trivial a thing to worry about. He began to forget his own body. Surely it was somebody else's bone and tissue that lay floating in the 8-branched snowflake. He knew that this was not so. He knew that if his body were killed, he would die. And yet there was no sense of fear, no personal involvement. It was an interesting problem in scheduling and nothing more. Would the human fighters get there in time? Perhaps the automatic machines had senses, for as the first of the humans burst into the tunnel they were using, a few hundred yards ahead of the lead load carrier, the machines shuddered to a stop. Paused for a second, then laboriously they began to back toward the nearest of the side passages that Tropile had been unable to block. He scanned it hurriedly. Good, good. The circuits surrounding the passage proper were out of his reach, but it led to another passage, an abandoned pipeline of sorts, it seemed, and that he could reach. Patiently, how slowly the machines crept along. He waited until one of the pyramid's machines bearing explosives passed through an enormous valve in the line. And then the valve was thrown. The explosion triggered every vehicle in the line. The damage was complete. Scratch one threat from the pyramids. And almost at once there was an urgent call from Alanarova. "Tropile, quickly!" The pyramids were the mightiest race of warriors the universe had ever known. They were invulnerable and unconquerable, except from within. Like Alexander the Great, they had met every enemy and whipped them all. And, like dying Alexander, they writhed and raged against the tiny, unseen bacillus within themselves. Blindly, almost suicidally, the pyramids returned to their ancient principle of shove and haul. The geography of the binary planet was like the hive of bees, nearly featureless on the surface, but internally a congresses of tunnels, chambers, warrens, rooms, tubes, and amphitheaters. The machinery and metal components were everywhere thick under the planet's crust. The more delicate and more useful components of flesh and blood were, to a degree, concentrated in a few areas. And one of those areas had disappeared. Tropile, battering futilely with his mind at the periphery of the vanished area, cried sharply to Alanarova and the others. "It looks as though they've broken a piece right out of the planet. Everything stops here. There's a physical gap which I can't cross. Hurry, one of you, what was that section for?" "Propulsion." "I see." Tropile hesitated, confused for the first time since his awakening. "Wait." He retreated to the snowflake and communed with the other 8-branch members, now become something that resembled his general staff. He told them. Most of them already knew. but the telling took so little time that it was simpler to go through it from the beginning to the end. The pyramids attempted to cut the propulsion pneuma out of the circuit some seconds or days ago, and were unsuccessful. We awakened additional components and were able to maintain contact with it. They have now apparently cut it loose from the planet itself. I do not think it is far, but there is a physical space between. The importance of the propulsion pneuma is this: it controls the master generators of electrostatic force, which are used both to move this planet and ours, and to perform the act of translation. If the pyramids control it, they may be able to take us out of circuit, perhaps back to Earth, perhaps throwing us into space where we will die. The question for decision: how can we counteract this move? A rush of voices all spoke at once. It was no trick for Tropile and the others to sort them out and follow the arguments of each, but it cannot be reproduced. At last one said, "There is a way. I will do it." It was Eleanorova. "What is the way?" Tropile demanded, curiously alarmed. "I shall go with them, trace the areas the pyramids are attempting to isolate, place my entire self." By this she meant her concentration, her psyche, that part of all of them which flashed along the neuron guides, unhampered by flesh or distance. "In the most likely point they will next cut loose, and then I shall cause the propulsion units on the severed section to force them back into circuit." Tropile objected. "But you don't know what will happen. We have never been cut off from our physical bodies, Eleanorova. It may be death. It may not be possible at all. You don't know." Eleanorova thought a smile and a farewell. She said, "No, I do not." And then, "Goodbye, Tropile." She had gone. Furiously, Tropile hurled himself after her, but she was quick as he, too quick to catch. She was gone. "Foolishness! Foolishness!" he shouted silently. "How could she do an insane, chancy thing like this?" And yet, what else was there to do? They were all ignorant babies, temporarily successful because there had been no defense against them. For who expects babies to rise up in rebellion? They didn't know. For all they could guess or imagine, the pyramids had an effective counter for any move they might make. Temporary success meant nothing. It was the final decision that counted, when either the pyramids were vanquished or the men. And what steps were needed to make that decision favor the men were anyone's guess. Eleanorova was as good as he. Tropile could only watch and wait. Through a great many viewpoints and observers, he was able to see roughly what happened. There was a section of the planet next the severed chunk, where the mind and senses of Eleanorova lay coiled for a moment, and were gone. For what it had accomplished, her purpose succeeded. She had been taken. She was out of circuit. The overwhelming consciousness of loss that flooded through Glenn Tropile was something outside of all his experience. Next to him, in the snowflake, the body which he had learned to think of as the body of Eleanorova twisted sharply, as though waking from a dream, and lay flaccid, floating in the fluid. "Eleanorova! Eleanorova!" There was no answer. A voice came precisely. "Tropile! Here and now! Quickly!" "Goodbye, Eleanorova." He flashed away to see what the other voice had found. Great, mindless boulders were being chipped away from the crust of the binary planet and whirled like midgets in the void around it. "What is it?" cried one of the others. Tropile had no answer. It was the pyramids, clearly. Were they attempting to demolish their own planet? Were they digging away at the crust to uncover a maggot's nest of unawakened components beneath? "The air!" cried Tropile sharply, and knew it was true. What the pyramids were up to was a simple delousing operation. If you could destroy their own machinery for maintaining air and pressure and temperature, they would destroy all living things within, including Handel and Citizen Germain, and thus, in the final analysis, including the bodies of Tropile and his awakened fellows. For without the mobile troops to defend their helpless cocoons against the machines of the pyramids, the limp bodies could be destroyed as easily as a larva under a farmer's heel. So Eleanorova had failed. Alone against the pyramids, she had been unable to bring the recaptured sections back into the circuit that Tropile's components now dominated. It was the end of hope, But it was not the fear of defeat and the damnation of the earth that paralyzed Tropile. It was Eleanorova, gone from him forever. The pyramids were too strong. And yet, he thought quickeningly, they had been too strong before, and still a weak spot had been found. Think, he ordered himself desperately. And then again, think. Components stirred restlessly around him, questioning. Think, he cried mightily. All of you, think. Think of your lives and hopes. Think, hope, worry, dream. The components were reaching toward him now, wonderingly. He commanded them violently. Do it! Concentrate! Wish! Think! Let your minds run free and think of Earth, pleasant grass and warm sun. Think of loving and sweating and heartbreak. Think of death and birth. Think, for the love of heaven. And the answer was not a sound, but it was deafening. In the cutoff sections, Eleanorova's soaring mind lay trapped. It had not been enough. She could not force her will against the dull inflexibility of the pyramids. Until that inflexibility began to waver, there was a leakage of thought. It maddened and baffled the pyramids. The whole neuronic network was resounding to the babble of thoughts and emotions that, to a pyramid, were utterly demented. The rousing component minds throbbed with urge and emotion that were new to the pyramid experience. What could a pyramid make of human sex drive, or of the ropey-armed alien's passionate defecation of the egg? What of hunger and thirst and the blazing wolf need for odds and advantage that streamed out of such as Tropile? They wavered, unsure. Their reactions were slow and very confused. For Eleanorova succeeded in her purpose. She was able to reach out across the space and barrier to Tropile, and the propulsion pneuma was back in circuit. The section that controlled the master generators of the electronic scythe lay under his hands. Now, he cried, and all of the components reached out to grasp and move. Now, and the central control was theirs. The full flood of power for the generators was at their command. Now, now, now! And they reached out with a fat pencil of electrostatic force and caught the sluggish, brooding pyramid on Mount Everest. It had squatted there without motion for more than 2 centuries. Now it quivered and seemed to draw back, but the probing pencil caught it and hurled it up and out of Earth into the tiny artificial sun. It struck with a flare of blue-white light. One gone, gloated Tropile. Eleanorova, are you there? Still here, she called from a great distance. Again? Again! They reached for the pyramids and found them wherever they were. Some lay close to the surface of the binary planet. Some were hundreds of miles within. And a few, more desperate than the others, or merely assigned to a task, they discovered at the very portal of the single spaceship of the pyramids. But wherever they were and whatever they chose to do, each one of them was found and seized. They came wriggling and shaking like trout on an angler's line. They came bursting through layer on layer of impenetrable metal that, nevertheless, they penetrated. They came by the dozens and scores, and at last by the thousands. But they came. There were more and more flares of blue-white light on the tiny sun, so many that Tropile found himself scouring the planet in the desperate search for one surviving pyramid, not to destroy as an enemy, but to keep as a specimen. But he searched in vain. The pyramids were destroyed, gone. There was not one left. The Earth lay open and free under its tiny sun for the first time in centuries. It had been a strange war, but a short one. And it was over. The end of Chapter 14 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. Chapter 15 of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tropile swam up out of the hammering blackness into daylight and pain. It hurt. He was being born again, coming back to life. And it had all the agonies of parturition, except that they were being visited upon the creature being born, himself. There were crushing blows at his temples. that pounded and pained like no other ache he had ever felt. He moaned raspingly. Someone moved blurrily over his shut eyes. He felt something sting sharply at the base of his brain. Then it tingled, warming his scalp, comforting it, numbing it. Pain went slowly away. He opened his eyes. 4 masked torturers were leaning over him. He stared, not understanding, but the eyes were not torturers' eyes, and in a moment the masks came off. Surgical masks, and the faces beneath the masks were human faces. Surgeons and nurses. He blinked at them and said groggily, "Where am we?" And then he remembered. He was back on Earth. He was merely human again. Someone came bursting into the room, and he knew without looking that it was Haendl. "We beat them, Tropile," Haendl cried. "No, cancel that. You beat them. We've destroyed every pyramid there was, and a nice hot fire they're making up there on the sun, eh? Beautiful work, Tropile, beautiful. You're a credit to the name of Wolf." The surgeons stirred uneasily, but apparently, Tropile thought, there had been changes, for they did no more than that. Tropile touched his temples fretfully, and his fingers rested on gauze bandages. It was true. He was out of circuit. The long reach of his awareness was cut short at his skull. There was no more of the infinite sweep and grasp he had known as part of the snowflake in the nutrient fluid. "Too bad," he whispered hoarsely. "What?" Haendl frowned. The nurse next to him whispered something, and he nodded. "Oh, I see. You're still a little groggy, right? Well, that's not hard to understand. They tell me it was a tricky job of surgery, separating you from that gunk the pyramids had wired into your head." "Yes," said Tropile, and closed his eyes, though Haendl went on talking. After a while, Tropile pushed himself up and swung his legs over the side of the operating table. He was naked. Once that would have bothered him enormously, but now it didn't seem to matter. "Find me some clothes, will you?" he asked. "I'm back. I may as well start getting used to it." Glenn Tropile found that he was a returning hero, attracting a curious sort of hero worship wherever he went. It was not, he thought after careful analysis, exactly what he might have expected. For instance, a man who went out and killed a dragon in the old days was received with great gratitude and rejoicing, and if there was a prince's daughter around, he married her. Fair enough, after all. And Tropile had slain a foe more potent than any number of dragons. But he tested the attention he received and found no gratitude in it. It was odd. What it was like most of all, he thought, was the sort of attention a reigning baseball champion might get in a country where cricket is the national game. He had done something which, everybody agreed, was an astonishing feat, but about which nobody seemed to care. Indeed, there was an area of accusation in some of the attention he got. Item: nearly 90,000 erstwhile components had now been brought back to ambient life, most of them with their families long dead, all of them a certain drain on the limited resources of the planet. And what was Glenn Tropile going to do about it? Item: the old distinctions between citizen and wolf no longer made much sense, now that so many componentized citizens had fought shoulder to shoulder with componentized sons of the wolf. But didn't Glenn Tropile think he had gone a little too far there? And item: looking pretty far ahead, of course, but still, well, just what was Glenn Tropile going to do about providing a new sun for Earth when the old one wore out and there were no more pyramids to tend the fire? He sought refuge with someone who would understand him. That, he was pleased to realize, was easy. He had come to know several persons extremely well. Loneliness, the tortured loneliness of his youth, was permanently behind him, definitely. For example, he could seek out Haendl, who would understand everything very well. Haendl said, "It is a bit of a letdown, I suppose. Well, hell with it. That's life." He laughed grimly. "Now that we've got rid of the pyramids, there's plenty of other work to be done. Man, we can breathe now. We can plan ahead. This planet has maundered along in its stupid, rutted, bogged-down course too many years already, eh? It's time we took over, and we'll be doing it, I promise you. You know, Tropile, he snickered, I only regret one thing. What's that? Tropile asked cautiously. All those weapons out of reach. Oh, I'm not blaming you. But you can see what a lot of trouble it's going to be now, stocking up all over again. And there isn't much we can do about bringing order to this tired old world, is there, until we've got guns to do it with again. Tropile left him much sooner than he had planned. Citizen Germain, then. The man had fought well, if nothing else. Tropile went to find him, and, for a moment at least, it was very good. Germain said, I've been doing a lot of thinking, Tropile. I'm glad you're here. He sent his wife for refreshments, and decorously she brought them in, waited for exactly 1 minute, and then absented herself. Tropile burst into speech as soon as she left. I'm beginning to realize what has happened to the human race, Germain. I don't mean just now, when we licked the pyramids and so on. No, I mean hundreds of years ago, what happened when the pyramids arrived, and what is happening since. Did you ever hear of the Indians, Germain? Germain frowned minutely and shrugged. They were, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They were a different color and not very civilized. Of course, nobody was then. But the Indians were nomads, herdsmen, hunters, like that. And the white people came from Europe and wanted this country for themselves. So they took it. And do you know something? I don't think the Indians ever knew what hit them. They didn't know about land grants and claiming territory for the crown and the church missions and expanding populations. They didn't have those things. It's true that they learned pretty well by and by. At least they learned things like guns and horses and firewater. They didn't have those things either. But they could see some sense to them, you know. And I really don't think the Indians ever knew exactly what the Europeans were up to until it was too late to matter. And it was the same with us in the pyramids, only more so. What the devil did they want? I mean, yes, we found out what they did with the translated people, but what were they up to? What did they think? Did they think? You know, I've got kind of a crazy idea. Maybe it's not crazy. Maybe it's the truth. Anyway, I've been thinking. Suppose even the pyramids weren't the pyramids. We never talked to one of them. We never gave it a Rorschach or tested its knee jerks. We licked them, and we don't know anything about them. We didn't even know if they were the guys that started the whole bloody thing, or if they were just sort of supersized components themselves, do we? And meanwhile, here's the human race, up against something that it not only can't understand, same as the Indians couldn't the whites, but that it can't begin to make a guess about. At least the Indians had a clue now and then, you know. I mean, they'd see the sailors get off the great white devil ships making a beeline for the Indian women and so on, and they'd begin to understand that there was something in common. But we don't have that much. So what did we do? Why, we did like the reservation Indians. We turned inward. We got loaded on firewater, meditation, and we closed our minds to the possibility of ever expanding again. And there we were, all tied up in our own knots. Most of the race rebelled against action because it had proved useless, citizens. A few of the race rebelled against that because it was not only useless, but deliberately useless. Wolves. But they're the same kind of people. You've seen that for yourself, right? And... Tropile stopped, suddenly aware that Citizen Germain was looking tepidly pained. What's the matter? Tropile demanded harshly. Citizen Germain gave him the faint, deprecatory, quirked smile. I know you thought you were a wolf, but I told you I've been thinking a lot, and that's what I was thinking about. Truly, citizen, you do yourself no good by pretending that you really thought you were a wolf. Clearly, you were not. The rest of us might have been fooled, but certainly you couldn't fool yourself. Now, here's what I think you ought to do. When I found you were coming, I asked several rather well-known citizens to come here later this evening. There won't be any embarrassment. I only want you to talk to them and set the record straight, so that this terrible blemish will no longer be held against you. Times change, and perhaps a certain latitude is advisable now. But certainly you don't want... Tropile also left Citizen Germain sooner than he expected to. There remained Eleanorova, but, queerly, she was not to be found. Instantly it became clear to Tropile that it was she, above all, whom he needed to talk to. He remembered the shared beauty of their plunging drives through the neuronic guides of the pyramids, the linked and inexorable flow of their thoughts and of their most hidden feelings. She could not be very far, he thought numbly, cursing the blindness of his human eyes, the narrowness of his human senses. Time was when two worlds could not have hidden her from him. He walked from place to place with the angry, resentful tread of one used to riding, no, to flying, or faster than flying. He asked after her. He searched. And at last he found, not her, a note. At one of the stations where the reawakened components were funneled back into human affairs, there was a letter waiting for him. I'm sure you will look for me. Please don't. You thought that there were no secrets between us, but there was one. When I was translated, I was 61 years old. 2 years before that, I was caught in a collapsing building. My legs are useless, and I have grown quite fat. I do not want you to see me fat and old. Eleanorova. And that was that. And at last Glenn Tropile turned to the last person of all those on his list who had known him well. Her name was Gala Tropile. She had got thinner, he observed. They sat together quietly, and there was considerable awkwardness, but then he noticed that she was weeping. Comforting her ended the awkwardness, and he found that he was talking. It was like being a god, Gala. I swear there's no feeling like it. I mean, it's like, well, maybe if you just had a baby and invented fire and moved a mountain and transmuted lead into gold. Maybe if you'd done all those things, then you might have some idea. But I was everywhere at once, Gala. I could do anything. I fought the whole world of pyramids. Do you realize that? Me. And now I've come back to... He stopped her in time. It seemed she was about to weep again. He went on. No, Gala, don't misunderstand. I don't hold anything against you. You were right to leave me in the field. What did I have to offer you? Or myself, for that matter. And I don't know that I have anything now, but... He slammed his fist against the table. They're talking about putting the Earth back in its orbit. Why? And how? My God, Gala, we don't know where we are. Maybe we could tinker up the gadgets the pyramids used and turn our course backward. But do you know what Old Soul looks like? I don't. I never saw it. And neither did you or anyone else alive. It was like being a god, and they are talking about going back to things as they were. I'm sick of that kind of thinking. Wolves or citizens, they're dead on their feet and don't know it. I suppose they'll snap out of it in time, but I can't wait. I won't live that long. Unless... He paused and looked at her, confused. Gala Tropile met her husband's eyes. Unless what, Glenn? He shrugged and turned away. Unless you go back, you mean? He stared at her. She nodded. You want to go back, she said without stress. You don't want to stay here with me, do you? You want to go back into that tub of soup again and float like a baby. You don't want to have babies. You want to be one. Gala, you don't understand. We can own the universe. I mean, mankind can. And I can do it. Why not? There's nothing for me. That's right, Glenn. There's nothing for you here. Not anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, looked at her, spread his hands helplessly. He didn't look back as he walked out the door, but he knew that his back was turned not only on the woman who happened to be his wife, but on mankind and all the flesh. It was night outside and warm. Tropile stood in the old street surrounded by the low, battered houses, and he could make them new and grand. He looked up at the stars that swung in constellations too new and changeable to have names. There was the universe. Words were no good. There was no explaining things in words. Naturally, he couldn't make Gala or anyone else understand, for flesh couldn't grasp the reality of mind and spirit that were liberated from flesh. Babies, a home, and the whole grubby animal business of eating and drinking and sleeping. How could anyone ask to stay in the mire when the stars challenged overhead? He walked slowly down the street, alone in the night, an apprentice godling, renouncing mortality. There was nothing here for him, so why this sense of loss? Duty said, or was it pride, someone must give up the flesh to control Earth's orbit and weather. Why not you? Flesh said, or was it his soul, whatever that was, but you will be alone. He stopped, and for a moment he was poised between destiny and the dust, until he became aware of footsteps behind him, running, and Gala's voice. Wait, Glenn! I want to go with you. And then he turned and waited, but only until she caught up, and then he went on. But not forever and always again, not alone. The end of Wolfbane by Frederik POHL and C.M. KORNBLUTH.